This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. That night started out like any other. It was pouring rain outside, really coming down hard. I remember thinking it was nice to be inside where it was dry as I settled in at the security desk. The first few hours went by slowly as usual. I did my rounds, checked the cameras, sipped my coffee. Nothing out of the ordinary. Around 2 a.m., I was half dozing in my chair when suddenly one of the door alarms went off. It jolted me awake instantly. My heart started racing as I quickly scanned the camera feeds, trying to figure out which door had been triggered. I spotted some movement on one of the exterior cameras and zoomed in, but I couldn't make out much in the darkness and rain. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed out to investigate, my hand shaking slightly as I unlocked the door to the main warehouse floor. The huge open space felt especially dark and ominous as I shined my light around. I made my way cautiously to the back door that had been alarmed, straining my ears for any sound. But all I could hear was the pounding of the rain on the metal roof. When I reached the door, it was closed and locked. I checked it thoroughly but couldn't find any signs of tampering or forced entry. I stood there for a few minutes, shining my light out the small window into the rainy parking lot, but saw nothing unusual. Eventually, I chalked it up to a glitch in the system and headed back to the security office, though I couldn't shake the unsettled feeling in my gut. I tried to relax and told myself I was being paranoid, but I found myself obsessively checking and rechecking the camera feeds. Around 3:30 a.m., I thought I heard a faint noise coming from somewhere in the warehouse. It was hard to be sure over the sound of the rain, but it sounded almost like metal scraping on concrete. I muted the TV that was quietly playing in the background and held my breath, listening intently. There it was again, a dragging, scraping sound. My mouth went dry and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should go check it out, but every instinct was screaming at me to stay put. After a few moments of internal debate, I forced myself to get up and head out onto the warehouse floor again. The beam of my flashlight seemed pitifully small in the cavernous space. I moved as quietly as I could, pausing every few steps to listen. The sound had stopped, but now I thought I could hear faint footsteps. I rounded a corner and my blood ran cold. One of the interior doors that should have been locked was standing wide open. I played my light over the doorway but saw no one. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my radio to call the police. Just as I was about to speak into it, I heard a loud crash from somewhere nearby that made me jump out of my skin. I sprinted back to the security office, slamming and locking the door behind me. I called 911 with shaking hands and tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. Those next 15 minutes waiting for the police to arrive were some of the longest of my life. I huddled in the corner of the tiny office, eyes glued to the monitors, terrified of what I might see. When I finally heard the blessed sound of sirens approaching, I nearly wept with relief. I let the officers in, and they did a thorough sweep of the building. After what felt like an eternity, they radioed that they had found someone. They brought out a wild-eyed man, clearly high on something. He was muttering incoherently and struggling against the officers. When they searched him, they found a hammer in his coat pocket. I felt sick imagining what could have happened if he had managed to get to me before the police arrived. The officers told me the guy was probably just looking for a dry place to crash and get high. But something about the crazed look in his eyes and that hammer made me think he had more sinister intentions. I'll never know for sure what he was planning to do. I quit that job the very next day. I couldn't stand the thought of being alone in that warehouse at night ever again. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound would jolt me awake in a panic. I kept replaying that night over and over, imagining all the horrible ways it could have ended. It's been almost a year now, and I still get chills thinking about it. That night changed me. I'm jumpier, more paranoid. I don't like being alone in big empty spaces anymore. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the sound of those footsteps and that open door. I know objectively that nothing too terrible actually happened. The guy was caught, I wasn't hurt, but it's the what-ifs that haunt me. What if the police hadn't gotten there in time? What if he had found me before I made it back to the office? What was he planning to do with that hammer? I've tried therapy, meditation, you name it, but I don't think I'll ever fully shake the fear I felt that night. It opened my eyes to how quickly things can go wrong, how vulnerable we really are. I'm grateful nothing worse happened, but part of me will always be back in that dark warehouse, heart racing, listening for footsteps in the shadows. I still avoid being out alone at night whenever possible. Rainy nights are the worst. The sound of rain on a metal roof immediately transports me back. I've had to leave parties and gatherings early because the anxiety got too overwhelming. My friends and family try to be understanding, but I know they don't fully get it. How could they, unless they've felt that paralyzing fear themselves? I've thought about reaching out to other night shift workers or security guards to see if they've had similar experiences. Part of me wants to know I'm not alone in this, that others understand. But another part of me is afraid of dredging up those memories and emotions again. For now, I'm just trying to take it one day at a time. I'm working a day job now in an office with lots of people around. It helps, but I still find myself constantly checking over my shoulder, hyper-aware of my surroundings. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. I often wonder about that man they caught. Did he get help? Is he still out there somewhere? What if he tries something like that again and the next person isn't as lucky as I was? These thoughts keep me up at night sometimes. I know I should probably be over it by now. Nothing actually happened to me after all. But trauma doesn't always make sense. That night shattered my sense of security in a way I never could have anticipated. It showed me how quickly a normal, mundane evening can turn into a nightmare. I'm sharing this as a reminder to always trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't ignore that gut feeling like I initially did. And please, be careful out there. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. I was working as a police officer in our small town back then. It was a quiet place where not much ever happened, so when we got a call about some teenagers breaking into the abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town, I figured it would be a routine check. That building had been empty for over a decade, slowly falling into disrepair. Kids would occasionally sneak in there on dares, but it was nothing we couldn't handle. It was close to midnight when I pulled up to the hospital grounds. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the crumbling structure. As I got out of my patrol car, I immediately felt uneasy. The air seemed thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I shook it off, chalking it up to nerves from being alone in such a creepy place at night. I flicked on my flashlight and made my way towards the main entrance. The front doors were chained shut, but I noticed a broken window off to the side that looked like it had been recently disturbed. Glass crunched under my boots as I carefully climbed through. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint and debris-strewn hallways. I called out, identifying myself as police and asking if anyone was there. My voice echoed off the walls, but there was no response. As I made my way deeper into the building, I started noticing odd things. Occasionally I'd catch a flicker of movement at the edge of my flashlight beam, but when I'd swing around to look, there was nothing there. I'd hear what sounded like footsteps or whispers coming from other rooms, only to find them empty when I investigated. At one point, I distinctly heard the sound of a door slamming shut somewhere down the hall. I ran towards it, heart pounding, but found nothing but a dead end. When I turned back around, I could have sworn the hallway looked different somehow, like the layout had shifted. I tried to shake off the disorientation, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After about 20 minutes of searching, I hadn't found any sign of the reported teenagers. I was about to call it in and head out when something caught my eye. A faint glow coming from under a door labeled morgue. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the handle. As soon as I pushed the door open, a blast of frigid air hit me. It was easily 20 degrees colder in that room. My flashlight beam swept across rows of rusted gurneys and what looked like old body storage lockers along the walls. And there, in the center of the room, was a crumpled paper bag with several cigarette butts scattered around it, wisps of smoke still curling up from one of them. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Those cigarettes had to have been lit within the last few minutes, but I hadn't seen or heard anyone. Where could they have gone? Before I could process what I was seeing, there was a loud bang behind me. I whirled around to see the heavy morgue door slamming shut. I lunged for it, but it was too late. The latch had caught. I pulled with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic started to set in as I realized I was trapped. I pounded on the door, yelling for help, but I knew it was futile. No one else was in the building, and I was too far from the entrance for anyone outside to hear me. My radio wasn't working either, just static. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, broken only by my flashlight beam, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the body storage lockers was slightly ajar. I could have sworn they had all been closed when I first entered the room. I approached it warily, my hand shaking as I reached out to pull it open further. Just as my fingers touched the cold metal, I heard a low groan coming from inside. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing. That's when my flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into total darkness. I fumbled desperately to turn it back on, but nothing worked. In the pitch black, I could hear shuffling noises getting closer. Something brushed against my arm and I let out a scream, blindly lashing out. My fist connected with something solid but unnaturally cold. Suddenly, there was a deafening shriek that didn't sound human. I felt hands grabbing at me from all directions, icy fingers digging into my skin. I thrashed and fought, but there were too many. They were dragging me towards the storage lockers. I could feel the metal edge of one pressing into my back as they tried to force me inside. In that moment of absolute terror, my flashlight unexpectedly flickered back to life. The sudden burst of light revealed nothing. The hands were gone. The room was empty except for me. The door I had been so desperately trying to open now stood wide open. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I sprinted through those twisting hallways faster than I've ever moved in my life, not stopping until I burst out of the broken window and collapsed on the ground outside, gasping for air. When backup arrived a few minutes later, they found me still lying there, unable to speak coherently. We did a thorough search of the building, but found no trace of anyone else having been there. The morgue looked completely undisturbed, no cigarettes, no open lockers. If I didn't have the bruises on my arms where those icy hands had grabbed me, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. The real horror came a few days later when 2 local mothers reported their teenage sons missing. last seen heading towards the old hospital on a dare. We searched for weeks, but those boys were never found. It's been 6 years now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, remembering those unearthly shrieks and ghostly hands. I left the police force not long after, couldn't handle the job anymore. Some part of me is still trapped in that morgue, wondering what really happened that night and what became of those poor kids. I don't think I'll ever have answers, but I know one thing for certain. Whatever is in that hospital, it isn't human, and it's still there, waiting. It was snowing pretty heavily, which was unusual for October. The flakes were coming down thick and fast, blanketing everything in white. I remember thinking how eerie it looked outside, the snow muffling all sound, the darkness beyond the bright lights of the gas station. I felt isolated, cut off from the world. Around midnight I was restocking the coolers when I heard the distinct rumble of a vehicle pulling up to the pump. I glanced out the window, expecting to see someone getting out to fill up. But the SUV just sat there, engine idling. It was an older model, boxy and rusted. I couldn't see anyone inside through the snow-covered windows. After a few minutes I started to get uneasy. Why weren't they pumping gas or coming inside? I decided to go out and check if everything was okay. As soon as I stepped outside, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The SUV's driver's side door was wide open, but there was no one around. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice sounded small in the vast silence of the snowy night. No response. That's when I noticed the footprints in the fresh snow. A single set, leading away from the SUV towards the back of the station where we keep the dumpsters and storage shed. My heart started racing. Someone was here, hiding. Every instinct told me to go back inside and call the police, but stupidly, I decided to investigate. I followed the tracks, my boots crunching in the snow. They led right to the storage shed. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, my hand on the cold metal handle. What the hell was I doing? This was how people died in horror movies. But before I could turn back, I heard a noise from inside, a soft scraping sound. Gathering all my courage, I yanked the door open. For a split second, in the dim light from the station, I saw him. A man, impossibly tall and thin, crouched in the corner. He had a wild, tangled beard and eyes that glowed in the darkness like an animal's. But it was his expression that haunts me, a mixture of hunger and desperation that made my blood run cold. I stumbled backwards with a strangled yell. In that moment of panic, I tripped and fell hard on the icy ground. When I looked up, heart pounding, the man was gone. The shed was empty. Scrambling to my feet, I ran back to the station and locked myself inside. With shaking hands, I called 911. I babbled to the operator about the abandoned SUV and the man in the shed. They said they'd send someone right away. Those next 20 minutes waiting for the police were the longest of my life. I kept the lights on and huddled behind the counter, jumping at every sound. What if he tried to break in? What did he want? When the cops finally arrived, they did a thorough search of the property. But they found nothing, no sign of the man. The only evidence was the set of footprints in the snow, now partially filled in. They led from the SUV to the shed, then seemed to vanish into the field behind the station. The police ran the plates on the SUV, but it came back with no record. It was like the vehicle didn't exist. They ended up having it towed, but I could tell they were puzzled. One officer tried to reassure me, saying I'd probably just seen a homeless guy looking for shelter from the storm. But I know what I saw. That man, if it even was a man, wasn't normal. I quit my job at the gas station the next day. I couldn't bear the thought of working another night shift there. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gaunt face and those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. Even now, a month later, I'm not sure what to make of what happened. Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by the late hour and the isolating snowstorm? But then, how do I explain the SUV, the footprints? Sometimes I try to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a drifter passing through, someone desperate and possibly mentally ill. But deep down, I know that's not true. There was something profoundly wrong about that man, something inhuman. I've spent hours online, searching for similar experiences or any explanation for what I encountered. But I found nothing that quite matches up. It's like that night exists in its own pocket of unreality, disconnected from the normal world. I still avoid driving at night when I can. And gas stations? Forget it. I fill up in broad daylight now, and I'm always looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that rusted SUV pull up or catch a glimpse of a tall, bearded figure lurking at the edge of my vision. The rational part of my brain tells me it's over, that whatever happened that night was a one-time thing. But another part of me is terrified that it's not over at all, that somewhere out there, that thing is still roaming, waiting for another snowy night and an isolated victim. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what I experienced. The fear has seeped into my bones, changing the way I see the world. Every shadow holds potential danger now. Every stranger could be hiding something sinister behind their eyes. I've thought about seeing a therapist, but I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy. And maybe I am. Maybe my mind conjured up this whole scenario as some kind of stress response. But then I remember the bone-deep terror I felt in that moment, the primal, animalistic fear that overtook me when I saw that face. That wasn't something my mind could have invented, so I'm left with this unresolved mystery, this open wound in my psyche that refuses to heal. I jump at unexpected noises. I avoid being alone in isolated places. I scrutinize the faces of passers-by, looking for any hint of that wild, desperate hunger I saw that night. I know I need to move on, to put this behind me somehow. But how do you move on from something you can't explain? How do you make peace with the knowledge that there are things in this world that defy all logic and reason? All I can do is share my story in the hopes that maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. Maybe someone can shed light on what I encountered that snowy night at the gas station. Or maybe, just maybe, my warning will help someone else avoid the terror I went through. So if you're reading this, be careful out there, especially on those quiet, snowy nights when the world feels empty and still. Because sometimes, in those moments of isolation, the barrier between our safe, normal world and something much darker can become terrifyingly thin. And if you ever find yourself alone at a gas station in the middle of the night, and you hear the rumble of an old SUV pulling up, don't go outside to investigate. Lock the doors, call for help, and pray that whatever I encountered that night doesn't find you too. It was around 10 p.m. on a Friday, and I had one last delivery to make before my shift ended. The address was for some park on the outskirts of town. Weird, but not unheard of. People sometimes ordered pizza for late-night gatherings or whatever. I figured it was probably just some teenagers having a party. As I pulled up to the entrance of the park, I immediately got an uneasy feeling. The place was completely deserted and pitch black except for a single flickering streetlight. No cars in the parking lot, no sounds of people, just silence and shadows. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around and get the hell out of there. But I needed this job, and I didn't want to get in trouble for not completing a delivery. So against my better judgment, I got out of the car with the pizza. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. "Pizza delivery." No response. I stood there for a moment, debating what to do. That's when I noticed a figure emerge from the darkness near some trees. As they got closer, I could make out that it was a man, probably in his 40s, disheveled looking. He was walking kind of strangely, almost stumbling. "Hey there," I said nervously. "Did you order a pizza?" The man didn't respond at first. He just kept walking towards me with this glazed look in his eyes. When he got closer, I could see he was sweating profusely and shaking slightly. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked, taking a step back. That's when he finally spoke, his voice trembling. I'm fine. Everything's fine." But he clearly wasn't fine. Something was very, very wrong. I was about to suggest calling for help when suddenly I felt a sharp point pressed against my back. "Don't move," a deep voice growled in my ear. "Don't make a sound." My blood ran cold. I froze, too terrified to even breathe. The pizza box slipped from my hands and fell to the ground with a dull thud. "Both of you, start walking towards the woods, now." The voice was calm but threatening. I felt the knife point dig deeper into my back for emphasis. Shaking uncontrollably, I started moving forward. The other man, the one who had been acting strangely, walked alongside me. His eyes were wide with fear, darting around frantically. As we entered the tree line, the darkness seemed to swallow us whole. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. Branches scratched at my face and arms as we stumbled forward. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Was this some kind of setup? A robbery gone wrong? Or something much, much worse? We had only gone about 50 yards into the woods when everything changed in an instant. The man next to me suddenly shoved me hard, sending me sprawling to the ground. As I hit the dirt, I heard him yell, "Run!" followed by the sound of someone crashing through the underbrush. For a split second, I lay there stunned. Then I heard an enraged roar from behind me and heavy footsteps. The attacker had taken off after the other man. I didn't stop to think. Pure adrenaline and survival instinct took over. I scrambled to my feet and ran as fast as I could in what I hoped was the direction of the park entrance. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step. But I didn't slow down. I could hear distant shouts and the sounds of a struggle somewhere behind me, spurring me to run even faster. I burst out of the tree line, gasping for air, my lungs burning. My car was still there, thank God. I fumbled for my keys with trembling hands, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of there so fast I'm surprised I didn't crash. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, too afraid to go home in case I was followed. Eventually, I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, where I finally allowed myself to break down. I sat there sobbing, my whole body shaking as the reality of what had just happened hit me. When I finally calmed down enough to think straight, I called the police. They took my statement and searched the park, but found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of the other two men. It was like the whole thing had never happened. In the days and weeks that followed, I was a mess. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's terrified face, heard that threatening voice in my ear. I kept replaying the events over and over, wondering what would have happened if the other man hadn't pushed me down and run. Would I have been the one chased down in those dark woods? The thought made me physically ill. The police never found any leads. No one ever came forward with information. It was like those two men had simply vanished into thin air. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I'll catch a glimpse of the small scars on my arms from the tree branches, and I know it was real. I quit my job at the pizza place, obviously. I couldn't bear the thought of making another delivery. For months, I barely left the house. Even now, years later, I can't stand being out alone after dark. Parks and wooded areas are completely off limits. The worst part is the not knowing. Who were those men? What did the attacker want? Was it random, or was I specifically targeted? The questions haunt me to this day. I've replayed that night in my head thousands of times, but I'm no closer to understanding what really happened. I know I'm lucky to have escaped, but sometimes I feel like a part of me is still trapped in those dark woods, forever running from an unseen threat. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. I've never shared this story publicly before. Part of me is still afraid that talking about it might somehow bring those men back into my life. But I also know that keeping it bottled up inside isn't healthy. So here I am, finally letting it out. To anyone reading this who's been through something similarly traumatic, you're not alone. And to those who haven't, cherish your sense of safety and innocence. You never know when it might be shattered in an instant. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened that night, but I'm trying. One day at a time, I'm trying to reclaim the parts of myself that were lost in those woods, and I hold on to the hope that someday, somehow, I'll find the answers I've been searching for all these years. The order came in around 10 p.m. for a location I'd never been to before. When I pulled up the address on my GPS, I was surprised to see it led deep into the woods outside of town. I figured it must be some kind of campsite or something. As I drove down the dark, winding road into the forest, an uneasy feeling started to creep over me. The trees seemed to close in on either side, blocking out what little moonlight there was. After about 15 minutes of driving, I came to a small clearing off to the side of the road. I could see the glow of a fire through the trees, so I pulled over and grabbed the pizzas from my car. As I approached the clearing, I saw a group of about 8-10 people gathered around a large bonfire. They all turned to look at me as I walked up, but no one said a word. The silence was eerie. I could hear the crackling of the fire and the sounds of the forest, but the people were completely quiet. They just stared at me with blank expressions. Pizza delivery," I said awkwardly, holding up the boxes. A man near the front of the group slowly stood up and walked over to me. He was tall and thin, wearing all black. Without speaking, he took the pizzas and handed me some cash. I muttered a quick thanks and turned to leave, eager to get out of there. The whole vibe of the place was seriously creeping me out. As I walked back to my car, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being watched. I got in my car and started the engine, my hands shaking slightly. As I went to put it in drive, movement in my rearview mirror caught my eye. 2 dark figures were sprinting out of the woods behind my car. My heart leapt into my throat. I slammed on the gas and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I got home that night, I was still so shaken up that I called the police to report the incident. They said they'd send someone out to check it out. The next day, I got a call from the detective assigned to the case. He told me they'd gone out to the clearing I described, but found it completely empty. The fire pit was still warm, and there were some pizza boxes, but no sign of any people. What's more, when they tried to trace the phone number used to place the order, it came back as disconnected. The whole thing made no sense. In the days and weeks that followed, I kept replaying that night over and over in my mind. Who were those people? What were they doing out there? And who or what was chasing me as I left. I've racked my brain trying to come up with a rational explanation, but I can't. The memory of those blank stares and the sound of footsteps racing after my car still haunts me. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the fear I felt. That was all too real. Whatever happened that night in the woods, it's left me with a deep sense of unease that I just can't shake. I stopped delivering pizzas after that. I just couldn't bring myself to drive out to unfamiliar addresses anymore, especially at night. The incident changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself looking over my shoulder more often now, especially when I'm out alone. Shadows and strange noises set me on edge. I have trouble sleeping some nights, plagued by nightmares of dark figures chasing me through endless woods. Part of me wishes I'd never taken that delivery, that I'd just stayed home that night and let someone else handle it. But another part of me feels like I stumbled onto something important, like I caught a glimpse of something I wasn't supposed to see. I've tried researching similar incidents in the area, looking for any clues that might shed light on what I experienced. But I've come up empty. Whatever happened that night seems to be completely isolated. The detective eventually closed the case due to lack of evidence. He suggested that maybe it was just some campers having a bonfire who got spooked when I showed up. But that doesn't explain the disconnected phone number or the way they all stared at me in silence. And those figures chasing me, I know what I saw. They weren't just startled campers. The way they moved was unnatural, predatory, like they were hunting me. I've debated posting about this online before, but I've always hesitated. Part of me is afraid of sounding crazy. Another part worries that whoever, or whatever, was out there that night might somehow find out I'm talking about it. But I can't keep it bottled up anymore. The weight of carrying this secret, this inexplicable experience, has become too much. I need to get it out, even if no one believes me. I keep hoping that maybe someone else out there has had a similar experience, that I'm not alone in this. But so far I haven't found anyone. Sometimes I drive out to that area during the day just to reassure myself that it's real. The clearing is still there, though it looks so different in the daylight. Peaceful even. It's hard to reconcile it with the nightmarish scene from that night. I've thought about setting up cameras out there to see if anything strange happens. But honestly, I'm afraid of what I might capture. Some things are better left unknown. For now, I'm left with more questions than answers. The memory of that night lingers like a half-remembered nightmare. I go about my days trying to act normal, but inside I'm haunted by the knowledge that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. To anyone reading this, be careful out there. You never know what you might stumble upon in the dark. And if you ever get a pizza delivery request to a remote location in the woods, maybe just let that one go to voicemail. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night, but I do know that it changed me forever. The world feels different now, darker, more mysterious, and I'll never look at a pizza delivery the same way again. I've worked nights for years and I'm used to being alone in the store, but something felt off that night. Maybe it was the storm, or just my imagination running wild, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off and focus on my tasks, but I couldn't get rid of that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Around 1 a.m., I heard a loud banging on the front doors. My heart nearly stopped. We were closed, and nobody should have been trying to get in at that hour. I cautiously made my way to the front, and through the glass I saw a man standing there, completely drenched. He was pounding on the door and yelling something, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of the rain and thunder. I didn't recognize him as a regular customer, and something about him just felt wrong. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that were plastered to his body from the rain. But it was his face that really unsettled me. Even through the glass, I could see his eyes were wide and intense, almost manic-looking. I shouted through the door that we were closed and to come back during business hours. He kept banging and shouting for another minute or so, then abruptly turned and walked away into the darkness. I breathed a sigh of relief, but my hands were shaking as I went back to work. I told myself it was just some drunk guy confused about the hours, but I couldn't shake how unsettled I felt. About an hour later, I was in the back storage room when I heard a loud crash from the main store area. I froze, straining my ears. It could have just been something falling off a shelf, but after the incident earlier, I was on edge. I grabbed a heavy flashlight, the closest thing to a weapon I could find, and cautiously made my way out to investigate. At first, I didn't see anything amiss, but as I walked down one of the aisles, my blood ran cold. There were wet footprints on the floor, big ones, like from a man's boot, and they hadn't been there earlier when I'd mopped. I started to panic, realizing someone must have gotten into the store somehow. I looked around frantically, but didn't see anyone. The store suddenly felt huge, with too many places someone could be hiding. I knew I needed to get out and call the police. I started making my way toward the front doors, moving as quietly as I could. Every shadow made me jump. Every little sound had me whirling around. I was almost to the doors when I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. I broke into a run, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I heard the footsteps getting closer and then, bang! A gunshot rang out, so loud in the confined space that my ears were ringing. I felt something whiz past my head and heard it impact the wall in front of me. Pure terror gave me a burst of speed, and I crashed through the doors, setting off the alarm. I sprinted across the parking lot and didn't stop running until I reached the gas station down the street. The attendant took one look at my terrified face and called 911. The police arrived quickly and searched the store, but found no sign of the intruder. They did find the bullet hole in the wall, confirming my story. When they checked the security footage, we could see a dark figure entering through a back door I could have sworn I'd locked. The cameras caught glimpses of him moving through the store, but never a clear shot of his face. It's been months, and they still haven't identified the man or figured out why he targeted the store that night. I quit my job. I couldn't stand being in that place after dark anymore. I still have nightmares about those manic eyes I saw through the glass, about running for my life down those aisles. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the stress and loneliness of working nights finally got to me. But then I remember the sound of that gunshot, how close I came to death that night. I don't know why that man came into the store or what he wanted. All I know is that I'll never feel safe working alone at night again. The whole experience left me shaken to my core. For weeks afterwards, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear footsteps in my house. I installed extra locks and security cameras, but it didn't help much. Every little noise at night had me on edge, wondering if he'd somehow found out where I lived. I kept replaying the events of that night over and over, trying to make sense of it all. Why didn't he just rob the place? Why chase me and try to shoot me? It seemed so personal, so targeted, but I couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm me like that. The police investigation didn't turn up much. They found where he'd forced open the back door, but there were no fingerprints or other evidence left behind. The security footage showed him methodically checking each aisle as if he was looking for something specific. But nothing was stolen as far as we could tell. One detail that still haunts me is something I noticed when reviewing the footage. Just before he started chasing me, the intruder stopped and looked directly at one of the cameras. Even with the grainy quality and his face mostly hidden by a hood, I could see those same intense, manic eyes I'd seen earlier at the door. It was definitely the same man. In that moment on camera, he smiled. Not a normal smile. It was wide and unnatural, almost gleeful. Then he turned and started running towards where I had been. That image is seared into my brain. Sometimes I see it when I close my eyes. I've tried to move on with my life, but it's been difficult. I'm jumpy and paranoid, especially at night. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, waiting. Maybe I'm just being irrational, letting fear get the best of me. But then again, maybe my instincts are trying to warn me that it's not over. I've thought about moving to a new town, starting fresh somewhere he couldn't find me. But part of me is afraid that no matter where I go, he'll somehow track me down. It's like he's become this bogeyman in my mind, larger than life and impossible to escape. My friends and family have been supportive, but I can tell they don't really understand. How could they? Unless you've been through something like that, felt that pure terror and helplessness, you can't truly comprehend it. I try to explain, but the words always fall short. Some days are better than others. I'm seeing a therapist, trying to work through the trauma. But progress is slow. I still have trouble sleeping, still startle at unexpected noises. I hate feeling this way, scared and weak and always on edge. I want my old life back, but I'm not sure if that's possible anymore. The worst part is the not knowing who he was or why he came after me, not knowing if he'll try again someday. It's the uncertainty that really eats away at me. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if today will be the day he returns to finish what he started. I know rationally that the chances of him coming back are slim. The police assured me they would keep an eye out, that it was likely just a random act of violence. But it didn't feel random. The way he searched the store, the look in his eyes, it felt purposeful, personal. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel truly safe again, if I'll ever be able to walk alone at night without my heart racing, or sleep soundly through the night. I hope that someday this will all fade into a distant memory, just a scary story to tell. But for now, it's still all too real, too raw. I'm trying to stay positive, to not let this experience define me. But it's hard. That night changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. All I can do is take it one day at a time and hope that eventually the fear will subside and I can feel like myself again. Until then, I'll keep looking over my shoulder, keeping my eyes open for any sign of those manic eyes that haunt my dreams. As I made my way down the winding country roads, the houses became fewer and farther between. The last traces of civilization faded away as I turned onto a narrow dirt path cutting through dense forest. My GPS insisted I was going the right way, but an uneasy feeling started to creep in. After what felt like an eternity bumping down that rough path, I finally saw a dim porch light in the distance. The house was set far back from the road, barely visible through the trees. As I pulled up the long gravel driveway, I noticed how isolated it was. No other homes or buildings in sight, just endless dark woods all around. I grabbed the food and walked up to the front door, the gravel crunching loudly under my feet in the eerie silence. The porch light cast weird shadows, and I could see inside through a large front window. All the lights were on, but there was no movement or sign of anyone home. I rang the doorbell and knocked, but got no response. After a minute, I tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The door creaked open slightly. "Hello?" I called out. "Postmates delivery." Nothing but silence. A chill ran down my spine. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, but I had to at least try to complete the delivery. I cautiously pushed the door open wider and took a step inside. "Is anyone home? I have your food order." The house was eerily quiet and still. Through the doorway, I could see into a living room. Furniture covered in sheets, a thin layer of dust on every surface. It didn't look like anyone had been there in months. My heart was pounding as I set the food down on a table by the door. This whole situation felt so wrong. I turned to leave, eager to get back to my car and put this creepy place in my rearview mirror. But as soon as I stepped back outside, I knew something was terribly wrong. In the short time I'd been at the door, someone had slashed all 4 of my tires. They were completely flat, the car tilting at an odd angle. Panic surged through me as I sprinted to my car, fumbling for my phone. No signal. Of course there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. I was trapped. A twig snapped in the woods behind me. I whirled around, eyes straining in the darkness. Was that a shadow moving between the trees? My imagination was running wild, conjuring terrifying scenarios. I didn't want to find out what was out there. I took off running down the long driveway, desperate to put distance between myself and that house. Gravel crunched under my pounding feet as I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. About halfway down the drive, I heard it. Heavy footsteps behind me, getting closer. I wanted to look back, but I was too scared of what I might see. I pushed myself to run even faster, lungs burning, legs aching. Just as I reached the end of the driveway, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed and tried to wrench away, but the grip was like iron. I was spun around to face my pursuer. It was a tall man, his face hidden in shadow. In his other hand, he held something that glinted in the moonlight, a large knife. "Where do you think you're going?" he growled. Pure terror gave me a surge of adrenaline. I lashed out wildly, managing to break free of his grip. Without thinking, I plunged into the pitch-black forest, crashing through undergrowth, branches whipping my face. I could hear him pursuing, getting closer. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the wind knocked out of me. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But somehow I forced myself back up, ignoring the pain, and kept running. I had no idea where I was going, just trying to get away. After what felt like hours of panicked flight, I finally broke through the tree line onto a road. By some miracle, a car was approaching. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The driver slammed on their brakes, looking alarmed. "Please, help me," I gasped out. "Someone's chasing me. I need to get out of here." The kind strangers let me into their car and sped away. As we drove off, I thought I caught a glimpse of a dark figure at the edge of the woods, watching us go. But it may have just been my frightened mind playing tricks. We drove to the nearest town, and they dropped me at the police station. I gave my statement, still shaking uncontrollably. The police seemed skeptical at first, but agreed to send some officers out to investigate. To my shock, when they went to the address I gave them, they found a normal family living there. The homeowners were baffled by the story, insisting they hadn't ordered any food that night. They had no idea what I was talking about. The police searched the area but found no sign of my slashed tires, the strange man who chased me, or any evidence to support my wild tale. I could tell they thought I was either crazy or making it all up, but I know what I experienced that night. The terror was real. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat. remembering those footsteps getting closer behind me in the dark woods. I've run through every possible explanation in my mind. Was it all just a vivid hallucination? A prank gone too far? Or something more sinister? Maybe I inadvertently interrupted some kind of criminal activity by showing up unexpectedly. I may never know the full truth of what happened, but one thing's for certain. I quit my job with Postmates the very next day. No delivery is worth risking your life over. These days I stick to well-lit, populated areas. The fear from that night has never fully left me. I still find myself looking over my shoulder sometimes, half expecting to see that dark figure emerging from the shadows. The sound of footsteps behind me can send me into a panic. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again after what I experienced. If you're thinking of doing delivery work, especially in remote areas, please be careful. Trust your instincts if a situation feels off. And maybe invest in some extra phone chargers and a spare tire. You never know when you might need them. I'm just grateful I made it out alive that night. But the questions still haunt me. Who was that man? What did he want? And what would have happened if I hadn't managed to escape? I shudder to think about it. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get answers. Part of me wants to go back to that house in daylight, to prove to myself it was real. But a bigger part of me never wants to set foot near those woods again as long as I live. All I know is that I'll never forget that terrifying night, alone in the dark with a killer on my heels. It's a miracle I survived to tell this story. So please, be safe out there. You never know what might be waiting for you at your next delivery. It was around 10 p.m. on a chilly October evening. I had been doing deliveries for a few hours already, trying to earn some extra cash to help pay for college. The night had been pretty uneventful so far, just the usual mix of fast food orders to apartments and houses. I was about to call it quits for the night when one last order came through on my app. The destination was unfamiliar, some kind of warehouse on the outskirts of town. I hesitated for a moment, but the payout was good, and it wasn't too far out of my way. What the hell, I thought. One more delivery and I'm done. As I drove out to the address, the surroundings got more and more industrial. Factories, storage facilities, abandoned lots. Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect someone to be ordering food delivery at this time of night. A sense of unease started to creep over me. I pulled up to the address and immediately got a sinking feeling in my stomach. It was a huge, dark warehouse that looked like it hadn't been used in years. All the windows were boarded up, and there wasn't a single light on anywhere. The only illumination came from my headlights and the glow of the street lamps. For a minute, I just sat there in my car, debating whether I should just cancel the order and get the hell out of there. But I needed the money, and I didn't want to risk getting a bad rating. It's probably just some night security guard or something, I tried to reassure myself. I'll be in and out in 30 seconds. I grabbed the food bag and reluctantly got out of my car. The silence was eerie. No sounds of traffic or city life out here, just a faint whisper of wind. I walked up to what looked like the main entrance, my footsteps echoing off the pavement. There was no doorbell or intercom that I could see. I knocked on the metal door, the sound reverberating hollowly. No response. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I was about to give up when I noticed a smaller side door off to my right. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. My heart started racing. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave, but some morbid curiosity made me inch closer to investigate. "Hello?" I called out nervously. "DoorDash delivery." No answer, just that oppressive silence. I pushed the door open a little wider and peered inside. It was pitch black, but I could make out what looked like a long corridor stretching into the depths of the warehouse. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing bare concrete walls covered in cobwebs and graffiti. Discarded pieces of machinery and broken pallets littered the floor. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, my voice shaky. "I have a food delivery for this address." That's when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from further down the corridor. I froze, straining my ears. It was definitely footsteps, slow and uneven, getting closer. My breathing quickened as I shone my light down the hallway. For a second I thought I saw a shadow move, just at the edge of the beam. Then suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, tall and gaunt, wearing tattered clothes. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his eyes reflecting in the light, wide and unblinking. He shuffled towards me with an unnatural, jerky gait. I stumbled backwards in terror, nearly dropping my phone. "Stay back," I yelled. "I'm just here to deliver food." The man kept coming, arms outstretched. That's when I noticed his hands, gnarled and claw-like, with long yellowed fingernails. A gurgling moan escaped his throat. Pure animal panic took over. I threw the food bag at him and ran. I sprinted back to my car as fast as I've ever run in my life, fumbling with my keys. I could hear shuffling footsteps behind me, getting closer. I finally got the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I floored it, tires squealing as I peeled out of there. I didn't slow down or look back until I was miles away, back in a populated area with streetlights and other cars around. I pulled over into a gas station parking lot, my whole body trembling. What the hell had just happened? Was that really some kind of monster, or just a homeless person or drug addict? Either way, I knew I had just narrowly escaped something awful. I canceled the order in the app and went home, but I couldn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, that shuffling figure emerging from the shadows. Every creak of the house made me jump. I tried to convince myself that I had just let my imagination run wild, that there was a logical explanation. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. A few days passed and I had almost managed to put the incident out of my mind. Then I got a call from the local police department. They wanted to ask me some questions about a delivery I had attempted to make to that warehouse address. My blood ran cold. Had something happened there? Did they find a body? 1,000 horrible scenarios flashed through my mind. I went down to the station, my nerves on edge. The detective interviewing me was calm and professional, but I could tell this was serious. He explained that someone had broken into that warehouse the night of my delivery. They had used a fake DoorDash account to lure a driver there, but the food was found untouched in the hallway. The intruder's true purpose was unknown, but they had ransacked some offices in another part of the building. I told the detective everything that had happened, though I downplayed the creepier aspects. I didn't want him to think I was crazy. He thanked me for the information and said they would be in touch if they had any more questions. As I left the station, a chill ran down my spine. What if I had gone further into that warehouse? What if I had waited around longer for the customer to show up? I could have walked right into who knows what kind of dangerous situation. To this day, I still don't know the full story of what happened that night. Was it really just a break-in or something more sinister? Who was that terrifying figure I encountered? I'll probably never get answers to those questions. All I know is that I quit doing deliveries after that. No amount of money is worth risking my life like that again. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that dark corridor and those glowing eyes emerging from the shadows. I don't think I'll ever forget the terror I felt in that moment. If you're a delivery driver, please be careful out there. Trust your instincts if a situation feels wrong. You never know what kind of danger could be lurking in the darkness, waiting for an unsuspecting victim to arrive. It started out as a totally normal Tuesday evening shift. The dinner rush had died down, and it was just me and my buddy Tim working. We were joking around, tossing pizza dough, and generally killing time until close. Around 9 p.m. I noticed this beat-up old Chevy sitting in the far corner of the parking lot. The lights were off, and I couldn't see anyone inside, but something about it gave me the creeps. I pointed it out to Tim, and he just shrugged it off. Probably some teenagers getting high or something, he said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. About an hour later, we got a delivery order for a house on the outskirts of town. Tim volunteered to take it, saying he could use the fresh air. 20 minutes later, he came back looking confused and a little freaked out. "Dude, that was weird as hell," he said, shaking his head. "The house was completely dark, looked like nobody's lived there in years. I knocked and rang the bell for like 5 minutes, but no answer. Then I hear this scratching sound coming from inside, like nails on a chalkboard. I got the hell out of there." We were both pretty spooked at that point. I went to check the parking lot again, but the old Chevy was gone. Part of me was relieved, but another part felt even more on edge. Like, where did they go? What were they up to? Things were quiet for the next couple hours. We were just about to start closing up when we heard this huge crash from the front of the store. We both jumped about a foot in the air. Tim ran to check it out while I grabbed a pizza cutter. Not much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. Turns out someone had thrown a big rock through the glass door. There were shards everywhere. We looked outside but couldn't see anyone. The parking lot was empty except for our cars. "What the fuck?" Tim kept saying. "What the actual fuck?" We called the cops, but by the time they showed up 30 minutes later, there wasn't much they could do. They took a report and told us to call if anything else happened, but I could tell they weren't taking it very seriously. Small town, not much crime. They probably thought it was just some punk kids causing trouble. After they left, we swept up the glass and boarded up the door as best we could. The owner said he'd get it fixed in the morning. Tim offered to give me a ride home since my car was in the shop, but I told him I'd be fine walking. It was only a few blocks, and I guess I thought the night air might help clear my head. Big mistake. I was about halfway home when I got that feeling again, like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around, and there it was, that same damn Chevy, creeping along the street behind me with its lights off. I started walking faster, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the car engine getting louder as it sped up. Just as I was about to break into a run, it screeched to a stop right next to me. The passenger window rolled down, and I saw a guy in a black hoodie leaning out. His face was hidden in shadow, but I swear I could feel him staring right at me. He didn't say anything, just held up this piece of paper with something scrawled on it. I couldn't make out what it said in the dark. I didn't stick around to find out. I booked it the rest of the way home, slamming and locking the door behind me. I was gasping for air, my legs shaking. I peeked out the window, but the street was empty. No sign of the car. I tried to calm myself down, told myself I was overreacting. But then, just as I was about to head upstairs to bed, I heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from the living room window. My blood ran cold. I crept over to the window, holding my breath. And there he was, hoodie guy, standing in my front yard, staring right at me. He raised his hand and knocked on the glass, harder this time. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my phone to call 911, but by the time the dispatcher answered, he was gone. The cops came again, did another sweep of the neighborhood, but found nothing. No car, no guy in a hoodie, no evidence that any of it had happened. I didn't sleep at all that night, or the next few nights, if I'm being honest. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out what it all meant. Was it just a series of random, creepy coincidences, or was someone targeting us for some reason? And if so, why? I've racked my brain trying to think if I've pissed anyone off recently, if there's anyone who might want to scare me. But I'm just a regular guy working a minimum wage job in a small town. I don't have any enemies that I know of. Tim and I have talked about it a bunch, trying to make sense of it all. He thinks maybe it was some kind of gang initiation thing, or maybe someone casing the pizza place to rob it. But if that's the case, why follow me home? Why the weird mind games? The thing that really gets me is how it all just stopped. After that night, nothing else happened. No more weird cars, no more creepy guys knocking on windows. It's like whoever was behind it all just vanished into thin air. Part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing, but I know I didn't. The broken door at the pizza place was real. The fear I felt that night was real. I still work at Joe's, but I'm always looking over my shoulder now. I've started carrying pepper spray, and I make sure to vary my route home each night. Tim thinks I'm being paranoid, but he didn't see what I saw. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget it. And a small part of me is always waiting, wondering if they'll come back to finish whatever they started. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over a year now. I was 16, working as a delivery driver for my parents' restaurant to make some extra cash during the summer. It was a pretty chill job most of the time. Cruise around town in my beat-up Civic, drop off some food, maybe get a few bucks in tips. But that day changed everything. It started out normal enough. My mom handed me an order for a farm way out on the edge of town. I'd never been out that far before, but the pay was good for the long drive. As I headed out, I cranked up my music and enjoyed the sunny afternoon. The farther I drove, the more isolated it felt. Fewer houses, more open fields and woods. After about 40 minutes, I finally spotted the address down a long gravel driveway. The place looked pretty run down. Peeling paint, overgrown yard, no cars in sight. I figured maybe they were out back in a barn or something. I grabbed the food bag and headed up to the porch, my shoes crunching on the gravel. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Called out, "Hello? Food delivery." Still nothing. I was about to call the customer when I heard a noise behind me. Before I could turn around, someone grabbed me from behind, wrapping an arm around my neck. I tried to yell, but they clamped a hand over my mouth. My heart was racing as two more guys appeared, coming around from the side of the house. They looked rough, dirty clothes, mean expressions. One of them had a knife. "Don't try anything stupid, kid," he growled. I was freaking out, trying to stay calm, but my mind was spinning. Were they gonna kill me? I managed to choke out, "Please, just take my money. I won't tell anyone." The guy holding me laughed. "Oh, we're gonna take a lot more than that." They dragged me around to the back of the house, my feet scraping in the dirt as I tried to resist. There was an old barn back there, and they shoved me inside. It was dark and musty, piles of junk everywhere. They threw me down onto the dirty floor. I tried to scramble away, but one of them kicked me hard in the side. I curled up, gasping for air. "Empty your pockets," the knife guy demanded. With shaking hands, I pulled out my wallet and phone. It wasn't much, maybe $40 in tips, my learner's permit. They seemed pissed there wasn't more. "Where's the rest of it?" one of them yelled, kicking me again. "That's all I have, I swear," I cried. The pain in my ribs was intense. They started searching me roughly, tearing at my clothes. I was terrified of what they might do next. But then they found my car keys. "Let's check the car," one of them said. Two of them left, leaving the knife guy to watch me. He paced back and forth, fidgeting with the knife. I lay there frozen, afraid to move. After what felt like forever, the other two came back. "Nothing good in the car," one reported. "Just some old CDs and trash." They seemed unsure what to do next. I heard them muttering to each other, but couldn't make out the words. Finally, the apparent leader spoke up. "All right, kid, here's what's going to happen. We're going to rough you up a bit more so you remember not to talk. Then you're going to drive away and forget you ever saw us. Got it?" I nodded frantically, willing to agree to anything to get out of there. But they weren't done with me yet. They took turns punching and kicking me, laughing as I cried out in pain. I curled into a ball, trying to protect myself. Eventually, they got bored. "That ought to do it," one of them said. They yanked me to my feet. I could barely stand. Everything hurt so bad. "Remember, kid, you say anything and we'll find you. And next time we won't be so nice." They shoved me towards the barn door. I stumbled out into the fading sunlight, my legs weak. I heard them laughing behind me as I limped to my car. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in. As soon as the engine started, I peeled out of there as fast as I could. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. I pulled over and broke down sobbing. Everything hurt. My face was swollen, my ribs ached with every breath. I was covered in dirt and bruises. I didn't know what to do. I was scared to go home, scared to tell anyone. What if they really did come after me? Finally, I called my parents. I could barely get the words out between sobs. They told me to come straight home. When I got there, they gasped at the sight of me. My mom burst into tears, and my dad looked angrier than I'd ever seen him. They took me straight to the ER. The police came while I was there. I told them everything, even though I was terrified. They took photos of my injuries and got all the details. A few days later, they went out to investigate the farm. They didn't find the guys, but they discovered something chilling. There was another delivery bag stashed in that barn from a different restaurant. The cops think those men may have done this before. It's been over a year, and they still haven't caught those guys. I have nightmares about it sometimes. I jump at every little noise. I can't bring myself to do deliveries anymore. My parents had to hire someone else. I don't know why they targeted me that day. Was it random? Had they been watching the restaurant? Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel safe again. Those men are still out there somewhere. What if they do this to someone else? Or what if they come back for me? I'm trying to move on with my life, but it's hard. I'm in therapy now, which helps some. But I still find myself looking over my shoulder, especially when I'm alone. I hope they catch those bastards someday. No one should have to go through what I did. I wouldn't wish that terror on anyone. For now, I'm just taking it day by day, trying to heal, trying to feel normal again. But a part of me knows I'll never be the same carefree kid I was before that day. Those men took more than just my money and phone. They took my sense of safety, my trust in the world. I'm working on getting it back, but it's a long road. I just hope that by sharing my story, maybe it will help someone else stay safe, because you never know what might be waiting for you down that lonely country road. My first instinct was to keep driving. It was late, I was alone, and picking up strangers is never a good idea. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the desperation in his face or the way he was limping. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. "Are you all right?" I called out, keeping the doors locked. He rushed to my window, rain dripping down his face. Thank God, I had an accident a few miles back. My car's totaled and my phone's dead. I've been walking for hours trying to find help. I hesitated, weighing my options. He seemed genuinely in distress, and I couldn't just leave him out here in the middle of nowhere. With a sigh, I unlocked the doors. "Hop in. There's a gas station about 20 minutes up the road. I can drop you there." Thank you," he said, climbing into the passenger seat. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped." As we started driving, I tried to make conversation to ease the awkward silence. "So what happened with your car?" "Huh? Oh, a deer ran out in front of me, swerved to avoid it and went off the road." Something about his tone felt off, but I brushed it aside. "That's rough. At least you're okay, though. What's your name?" "John," he replied after a beat too long. I nodded and focused on the road ahead, rain pelting the windshield. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed John staring at me intently. When I glanced over, he quickly looked away. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself I was just being paranoid. But as the minutes ticked by, the tension in the car grew. John kept fidgeting in his seat, his eyes darting between me and the road. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Fine," he muttered, "just anxious to get somewhere with a phone." I nodded and pressed down on the gas pedal a little harder, eager to reach the gas station. The sooner I could drop this guy off, the better. As we drove, I noticed John's hands were clenched into tight fists. His breathing had become rapid and shallow. Red flags were going off in my mind, but I was trapped. I couldn't just kick him out in the middle of nowhere. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, desperate to break the suffocating silence. John's head snapped towards me, his eyes wild. "What's it to you? You asking too many questions." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Just trying to make conversation, man. No need to get defensive." He let out a harsh laugh. "Right, just being friendly. That's why you keep looking at me, huh? You recognize me or something?" My heart was pounding now. What the hell had I gotten myself into? "Look, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to help you out." "Help me out?" he snarled. "Is that what you call it? Playing dumb won't save you." I saw the gas station's lights in the distance and nearly cried with relief. Just a few more minutes and I'd be free of this lunatic. As we pulled into the parking lot, John's demeanor suddenly changed. He plastered on a smile and his voice became sickeningly sweet. "Hey, thanks so much for the ride. I really appreciate it. Mind if I use your phone real quick before you go?" Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, but I was afraid of setting him off. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone. "Sure, here you go." The moment the phone touched his hand, John's face contorted with rage. He lunged at me, grabbing my shirt and slamming me against the window. "You think I'm stupid?" he roared. "I know you called them. Where are they?" I struggled against his grip, panic consuming me. "I don't know what you're talking about. Let me go." Just as I thought he was going to bash my head into the dashboard, the car was suddenly flooded with flashing blue and red lights. John's eyes went wide with fear. "Police! Put your hands where we can see them!" In a flash, John released me and tried to bolt from the car. But he didn't make it 2 steps before he was tackled to the ground by multiple officers. I sat there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. An officer approached my window, concern etched on his face. "Sir, are you all right? Are you injured?" I shook my head, still dazed. No, I'm okay. What's going on?" The officer's expression turned grim. "That man is a dangerous fugitive we've been tracking for days. He's wanted for multiple violent crimes. You're incredibly lucky we got here when we did." As the reality of the situation sank in, my legs gave out, and I slumped against the steering wheel. The officer helped me out of the car and sat me down on a nearby curb. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked gently. I recounted the events of the night, my voice shaking. With each detail, the officer's frown deepened. "You took an enormous risk picking him up," he said, "but your actions may have saved lives. We've been chasing him for days, always 1 step behind. If you hadn't given him a ride, who knows how long it would have taken to catch him?" I nodded numbly, still struggling to wrap my head around everything. As I watched them load John into a police car, the gravity of what I'd narrowly escaped hit me like a ton of bricks. I broke down, tears mixing with the rain still falling around us. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, statements, and phone calls to my family. By the time I was cleared to leave, the sun was starting to peek over the horizon. As I climbed back into my delivery van, utterly exhausted, the officer who'd first approached me came over. "You did a good thing tonight," he said, "but please, for your own safety, don't pick up strangers in the future, no matter how innocent they might seem." I nodded, the lesson etched permanently in my mind. As I drove away, my hands still shaking on the wheel, I couldn't shake the image of John's wild eyes or the feeling of his hands gripping my shirt. It's been months since that night, but I still have nightmares about what could have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Every time I see someone on the side of the road, my heart races and I grip the steering wheel tighter. I know I should feel proud for inadvertently helping catch a dangerous criminal, but mostly, I just feel lucky to be alive. That night taught me that sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're right there in plain sight, just waiting for someone to let their guard down. So if you're ever driving late at night and see someone who needs help, please call the professionals. Don't make the same mistake I did, because you never know who might be getting into your car and whether you'll make it to your destination alive. Destination was a bit odd, though. It was for a supermarket that I knew closed at 9 p.m., and it was already past 11. I figured maybe there were night shift workers restocking or something, so I didn't think too much of it. The order was just for a single bottle of water, which was strange. But hey, I don't judge. I picked up the water from a 24-hour convenience store and headed to the supermarket. As I pulled into the massive empty parking lot, a feeling of unease started to creep over me. The store was completely dark, and there wasn't another car in sight. I double-checked the address, thinking I must have made a mistake, but nope, this was definitely the right place. I sat there for a minute, debating whether to just cancel the order and leave, but I really needed the money, and I didn't want to risk getting a bad rating. So against my better judgment, I got out of the car. The moment my feet hit the pavement, I knew I'd made a huge mistake. The silence was overwhelming, no cars on the nearby streets, no ambient noise, nothing, just dead quiet. I felt exposed standing there in the vast empty lot, my car's headlights the only illumination. I pulled out my phone, thinking I'd try calling the customer, when suddenly I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind me. I whirled around to see two men walking towards me from the direction of the store. They were both tall and solidly built, wearing dark clothes and baseball caps pulled low over their faces. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place. "You the Uber guy?" one of them called out. His voice was gruff, unfriendly. I managed to stammer out a yes, clutching the water bottle tightly. "Good," the other man said as they got closer. "We've got another job for you." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear them over the blood rushing in my ears. I'm just here to drop off this delivery," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Then I need to get going." The first man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, you're not going anywhere just yet. See, we need someone with a car, and you're gonna help us out." They were only a few feet away from me now. I could see that one of them had a gun tucked into his waistband. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, backing up slowly towards my car. "Just take my wallet, take whatever you want. I won't say anything." "We don't want your money," the man with the gun growled. "We need you to transport some packages for us. You're gonna drive where we tell you, no questions asked. Got it?" I knew with absolute certainty that if I got in that car with them, I was as good as dead. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I hurled the water bottle at the closest guy's face as hard as I could and took off sprinting across the parking lot. I heard angry shouts behind me, then the sound of them giving chase. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, weaving between the light poles, trying to make myself a harder target. A gunshot rang out and I felt something whiz past my ear. That only made me run faster. I made it to the far end of the lot, where there was a tall chain-link fence separating it from a wooded area beyond. Without hesitation, I leapt and started climbing. I could hear them getting closer, another shot striking the fence near my leg. Somehow I made it over the top and half climbed, half fell down the other side, landing hard on my ankle. The pain was excruciating, but I forced myself up and limped into the woods as fast as I could. I heard them cursing on the other side of the fence, but it didn't sound like they were following me over. Still, I didn't slow down until I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, my whole body shaking. I had no idea where I was or how far I'd gone. My phone was still in my car, so I couldn't call for help. I was terrified they might come looking for me, so after catching my breath, I kept moving deeper into the woods. I spent hours stumbling through the dark forest, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. My ankle was throbbing and I was freezing in just my t-shirt and jeans. But the fear of those men finding me kept me going. Finally, as the sky started to lighten with dawn, I emerged onto a road. I flagged down the first car I saw, a woman on her way to work. I must have looked insane, filthy, wide-eyed, limping. But she stopped and let me use her phone to call the police. The cops took my statement, but said without any evidence besides my word, there wasn't much they could do. They did a sweep of the supermarket parking lot, but of course found nothing. My car was still there, untouched. I thought that would be the end of it. A terrifying experience, but one I could try to put behind me. But a few days later, I saw a news story that chilled me to my core. Another delivery driver had gone missing after accepting an order to that same supermarket late at night. He hadn't been seen or heard from in over a week. I went back to the police immediately with this new information. They seemed to take it more seriously, but said that without any solid leads, their hands were tied. They advised me to stay alert and report anything suspicious. It's been a month now, and that missing driver still hasn't been found. I can't sleep at night, constantly reliving those moments in the parking lot, imagining what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. I've quit my delivery job. I can't bring myself to drive alone at night anymore. I don't know who those men were or what they wanted. Human traffickers, organ harvesters, drug smugglers. My mind conjures up endless horrible possibilities. Sometimes I wonder if I just imagined the whole thing, if the stress and exhaustion of working nights made me hallucinate. But then I remember the sound of those gunshots, the feeling of abject terror as I ran for my life. That was all too real. I can't help but feel guilty about that other driver who disappeared. If I had done more, pushed the police harder, maybe he would have been warned. Maybe he'd still be safe at home with his family instead of God knows where. The worst part is the not knowing if they're still out there, watching me, waiting for another opportunity. Not knowing if that poor missing man is alive or dead. Not knowing why I was targeted or how many others might be in danger. I'm sharing my story now as a warning to others. If you're a delivery driver, especially working nights, please be careful. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't let the fear of a bad rating or losing a few bucks put you in a dangerous situation. It's not worth your life. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. Was it a planned ambush? A random crime of opportunity? Some sick game? I'll probably never know. All I can do is be grateful that I escaped and hope that somehow, someday, there will be justice for the driver who wasn't as lucky as me. But every time I drive past a dark, empty parking lot, my blood runs cold. Because I know firsthand that monsters are real, and sometimes they're just waiting for someone vulnerable to come along. It was around 11 p.m., and I was getting ready to clock out when the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting the usual drunk college kids ordering a midnight snack. Instead, I heard a woman's voice on the other end. She sounded off, hesitant, like she was choosing her words very carefully. "I'd like to place an order for delivery," she said quietly. There was something in her tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took down the order, a large pepperoni pizza and a 2-liter of Coke. Pretty standard stuff, but when I asked for the address, she paused for a long time before giving it to me. It was in a nice neighborhood across town, mostly big houses set back from the street. As I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe I was just tired after a long shift, but that woman's voice, it stuck with me. I loaded up the pizza and headed out. The streets were pretty empty at that hour. As I drove, my mind kept going back to that strange phone call. Why did she sound so nervous? Was I reading too much into it? When I pulled up to the house, I felt my unease grow. It was a huge place, easily the biggest on the block. But unlike the other houses with their porch lights on, this one was dark, no lights visible anywhere. I grabbed the pizza and Coke and walked up to the front door. My footsteps on the porch seemed way too loud in the quiet night. I rang the doorbell and waited, my heart pounding for some reason. After what felt like forever, I heard heavy footsteps approaching. The door swung open, and I found myself face to face with a man who looked wrong. He was sweating profusely, his t-shirt soaked through. His eyes were wide and darting around, never quite meeting mine, and he was breathing hard, like he'd just run a marathon. "Pizza," I managed to say, holding out the box. He nodded jerkily and reached for his wallet. As he fumbled with the bills, I caught a glimpse past him into the house. It was dark inside, but I could make out a hallway leading to a staircase. That's when I heard it, a thump from upstairs, followed by what sounded like muffled shouting. The man's head snapped up, and for a split second I saw pure panic in his eyes. "What was that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing," he said quickly, too quickly. "Old house, pipes make noise sometimes." But I knew that wasn't the sound of pipes. That was a human voice. He shoved the money into my hand and grabbed the pizza and Coke. "Thanks," he muttered, already closing the door. I stood there for a moment, frozen. My instincts were screaming at me that something was very, very wrong in that house. But what could I do? I had no proof, just a bad feeling and some strange noises. As I walked back to my car, I heard another thump from inside the house. This time, I was sure I heard a woman's voice, though I couldn't make out the words. I paused, looking back at the dark windows. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? In the end, I got in my car and drove away. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That woman on the phone, was she the same one I'd heard upstairs? Was she in trouble? Why did that guy seem so nervous? I tossed and turned all night, replaying the scene in my head. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed to do something. I called the non-emergency police line and explained what had happened, emphasizing the strange noises and the man's suspicious behavior. The officer I spoke to said they'd send someone out to do a welfare check. I felt relieved, thinking I'd done the right thing. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding, but at least someone would check it out. Later that day, I got a call back from the police. What they told me chilled me to the bone. They'd gone to the house and spoken with the man who answered the door, presumably the same guy I'd delivered to. He'd been calm and cooperative, inviting them in to look around. And here's the kicker. There was no sign of any woman in the house. No one else there at all. The officer told me they'd searched thoroughly, even checking the attic and basement. Nothing seemed out of place. The man lived alone, he said, and hadn't had any visitors recently. He even showed them his phone records. No calls to Pizza Hut the night before. I was stunned. How was this possible? I knew what I'd heard, both on the phone and at the house. I described the woman's voice again, the noises from upstairs. But the officer just said they'd found no evidence to support my story. As I hung up, my mind was reeling. Had I imagined the whole thing? No, I was sure I hadn't. I'd heard that woman's voice clear as day. I'd seen the fear in that man's eyes when the noises came from upstairs. But if the police couldn't find anything, what did that mean? Where had the woman gone? How had the man managed to hide all trace of her in just a few hours? I couldn't let it go. Over the next few days, I drove by the house several times, always at night. It was always dark, always quiet, no sign of life at all. I even worked up the courage to knock on the door once, in broad daylight. No answer. It was like the house was abandoned. Eventually, I had to accept that I might never know the truth about what happened that night. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something terrible occurred in that house. Sometimes I still hear that woman's hesitant voice in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat. I don't deliver pizzas anymore. I couldn't handle the stress of not knowing what I might encounter at each house. But I'll never forget that night, or the mystery of the woman who vanished without a trace. Every time I pass that house, I can't help but wonder, what really happened behind those dark windows? And is she still in there somewhere, waiting for someone to hear her cries for help? It was late afternoon as I was cruising down I-80 through Nebraska. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the empty cornfields on either side of the highway. Traffic was light, just me, a few other semis, and the occasional car heading home after work. I was getting a bit drowsy after hours of driving, so I cracked the window to let in some fresh air and turned up the radio. That's when I first noticed the beat-up sedan that had been tailing me for the last 20 minutes or so. At first, I didn't think much of it, probably just someone else making the long trek across the Midwest. But then I saw it abruptly speed up and swerve into the left lane to pass me. As it came alongside my cab, I glanced over and locked eyes with the driver, a scruffy-looking guy with a wild look in his eyes. He grinned at me in a way that sent chills down my spine. Then he jerked the wheel hard, forcing me onto the shoulder. I blasted my horn and swerved to avoid him, heart racing. What the hell was this lunatic doing? Before I could process what was happening, I saw two more vehicles up ahead, a pickup truck and an SUV, suddenly pull onto the highway from a service road and stop, blocking both lanes. It was an ambush. These weren't just reckless drivers. It was a coordinated attack. Adrenaline surged through me as I realized the dire situation I was in. I was alone on an empty stretch of highway, being boxed in by multiple vehicles. This was the kind of thing you see in movies, not something that happens to a regular guy like me just trying to do his job. But it was all too real. I slammed on the brakes, the heavy truck groaning as it fought against its own momentum. The sedan that had forced me over skidded to a stop ahead of me, and I saw three men jump out. They were all carrying guns. "Get out of the truck!" one of them yelled, aiming his weapon at my windshield. "Do it now or we start shooting." My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. If I got out, I was dead for sure. They'd kill me and take the truck. No witnesses. My only chance was to use the truck itself as a weapon and battering ram. With shaking hands, I threw the truck into reverse and floored it. The massive vehicle lurched backward, tires squealing. In my side mirror, I saw the guys from the sedan scrambling to get out of the way. I cranked the wheel hard, swinging the long trailer around in a wide arc. The guy who'd been yelling at me fired a shot that pinged off my door. I ducked instinctively, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. This was really happening. I was being shot at by actual criminals trying to hijack my truck. Once I had space, I slammed it into drive and gunned the engine. The truck roared forward, picking up speed. I aimed straight for the gap between the pickup and SUV blocking the road. It was going to be tight, but I had to try. More gunshots rang out, and I heard bullets thudding into the trailer behind me. I kept my head down and my foot pressed to the floor. The gap between the vehicles loomed ahead. It didn't look wide enough. I was going to crash. At the last second, I saw the driver of the SUV panic and swerve out of the way. I blew past them with inches to spare, smashing the pickup's side mirror clean off as I squeezed through. The truck shuddered from the impact, but kept going. I didn't dare slow down or look back. I just focused on putting as much distance between me and those maniacs as possible. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel steady. After a few miles with no sign of pursuit, I fumbled for my phone to call 911. When I finally pulled over at a truck stop an hour later, my legs nearly gave out as I climbed down from the cab on wobbly knees. I slumped against the side of the truck, my whole body trembling as the adrenaline wore off, and the reality of what I'd just survived hit me. The police arrived shortly after and took my statement. They seemed skeptical at first, like maybe I was making it up or exaggerating. But when they inspected the truck and saw the bullet holes and damage from sideswiping the pickup, they realized I wasn't kidding around. It turns out the family whose stuff I was moving was some big-shot CEO type. The detective told me they think this gang had inside information about the move and was targeting that specific truck for the valuable cargo. They'd probably been tracking me for hours, waiting for the right moment to strike. I gave my official statement, but I couldn't bring myself to continue the trip. I was too shaken up. The moving company sent another driver to take over, and I caught a flight back home. It took weeks before I could get behind the wheel of a truck again without having a panic attack. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about those terrifying moments on that lonely stretch of highway. The wild eyes of that first driver, the sound of gunshots pinging off metal, the absolute certainty that I was about to die. I can't drive on empty roads anymore without constantly checking my mirrors, paranoid that someone might be coming up behind me. I know I'm lucky to be alive. If I'd hesitated for even a few seconds, or if that SUV hadn't swerved at the last moment, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I'm grateful every day that I made it out. But a part of me died on that road in Nebraska, the part that felt safe and invincible behind the wheel of my big rig. I'll never be the same carefree trucker I was before. The open road that I once loved now feels like a gauntlet of potential threats and hidden dangers. I still don't know if they ever caught the guys who did this. Sometimes I imagine them out there, still prowling the highways, looking for their next victim. And I wonder how many other truckers or innocent drivers have found themselves in similar situations, alone and terrified on dark stretches of road. It makes me sick to think about. All I know is that I'll never take my safety for granted again. And I hope that by sharing my story, maybe I can help someone else stay alert and alive out there. Because the monsters aren't just in movies or campfire stories. Sometimes they're right there on the highway with us, hiding in plain sight until it's too late. Around 10 p.m., we got an order for a large pepperoni pizza to be delivered to an address across town. I didn't think much of it at first. The guy on the phone sounded a bit drunk, slurring his words, but that wasn't unusual for a Friday night. I grabbed the pizza, hopped in my beat-up Honda Civic, and headed out. As I drove through the darkened streets, I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The address was in a pretty rough part of town that I usually tried to avoid. Run-down houses, broken streetlights, sketchy characters hanging around on corners. I told myself I was being paranoid and to just deliver the pizza quickly so I could get out of there. When I pulled up to the house, all the lights were off except for a dim glow from what looked like a TV in the front room. The yard was overgrown and littered with trash. Everything about the place screamed bad news. But I had a job to do, so I grabbed the pizza and walked up to the front door. I rang the doorbell and waited, my heart starting to race a little. After a long pause, I heard heavy footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and a large man with a scruffy beard peered out at me. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol. "Pizza's here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man grunted and opened the door wider, gesturing for me to come inside. Every instinct was screaming at me not to enter, but I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. I took a hesitant step over the threshold. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Another man emerged from the shadows of the living room, moving to block the door behind me. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized I was trapped. The first man grabbed the pizza box from my hands and tossed it aside. "All right, kid, hand over your money and your phone and we won't hurt you," he growled. I froze, my mind racing in panic. This couldn't be happening. I was just here to deliver a pizza, for God's sake. The second man moved closer, and I saw the glint of a knife in his hand. "I said, give us your stuff," the first man yelled, grabbing the front of my shirt. In that moment, pure adrenaline and survival instinct took over. Without thinking, I shoved the man as hard as I could, catching him off guard. He stumbled backward, giving me a split-second opening. I spun around and bolted for the door, my legs pumping furiously. I heard angry shouts and pounding footsteps behind me as I sprinted down the front walk. My car was only 20 feet away, but it felt like miles. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking violently. Just as I reached the driver's side door, I felt a hand grab the back of my shirt. I yelped in terror and somehow managed to wrench free, my shirt tearing in the process. I dove into the car and slammed the door, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as one of the men reached my window. He pounded on the glass, his face contorted in rage. I threw the car into reverse and stomped on the gas, tires squealing. The car lurched backward, and I saw the man dive out of the way to avoid being hit. I peeled out of there as fast as my old Civic could go, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I kept checking the rearview mirror, terrified they might be following me. But the street behind me remained empty. I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, too shaken to go straight home or back to work. My mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. I kept replaying those terrifying moments over and over. If I hadn't managed to get away, I shuddered to think what might have happened. When I finally calmed down enough to think clearly, I knew I had to report it to the police. I drove to the nearest station, my hand still trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The officers took my statement and seemed to take the incident very seriously. They told me I'd done the right thing by coming in right away. Apparently there had been a string of similar robberies in that area recently, targeting delivery drivers and other workers who might be carrying cash. Over the next few days, I was a nervous wreck. I jumped at every little sound and couldn't sleep without having nightmares about those men breaking into my home. I kept replaying that night in my head, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Should I have been more cautious? Should I have refused to go inside? The what-ifs were driving me crazy. About a week later, I got a call from the police. They had arrested 2 men who matched the descriptions I'd given. When they searched their house, they found evidence linking them to multiple robberies and assaults in the area. The officers wanted me to come in to identify them in a lineup. Walking into that police station was one of the hardest things I've ever done. My palms were sweating and my stomach was in knots. But I knew I had to do it. I couldn't let those guys hurt anyone else. As soon as they brought the suspects in, I knew it was them. My heart started racing as I looked at their faces through the one-way glass. The officers assured me they couldn't see me, but I still felt exposed and vulnerable. I positively identified both men, my voice shaking slightly as I did so. The detectives informed me that both suspects had extensive criminal records, including several violent offenses. They told me how lucky I was to have escaped relatively unharmed. Apparently, some of their previous victims hadn't been so fortunate. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to get back to normal life. I quit my job at Domino's. There was no way I could face making deliveries again after what happened. I had trouble sleeping and would often wake up in a cold sweat, imagining those men breaking into my room. Gradually, with the help of therapy and support from my family, I started to feel safer. But that night changed me forever. I'm much more cautious now, always hyper-aware of my surroundings. I don't take my safety for granted anymore. Sometimes I still think about how differently things could have gone if I hadn't managed to get away. It terrifies me to imagine what those men might have done. But I try to focus on the fact that I did escape and that my report helped put 2 dangerous criminals behind bars. I know I'll probably never feel completely safe making deliveries or going to strangers' houses again. That innocence and trust is gone, but I'm trying to not let fear control my life. I'm working on finding a balance between caution and paranoia. If there's one thing I've learned from this whole ordeal, it's to always trust your instincts. If something feels off or dangerous, listen to that little voice in your head telling you to get out of there. It might just save your life, like it did mine that night. I still have a lot of healing to do, but I'm taking it one day at a time. Writing this all out has been cathartic in a way. Maybe sharing my story will help someone else stay safe or feel less alone if they've been through something similar. All I know is that I'm incredibly grateful to have survived, and I'll never take my safety for granted again. It was getting late, around 10 p.m., and I was eager to finish up my last delivery of the night. The address was way out on the edge of town, an area I wasn't super familiar with. As I drove further out, the houses got more and more spread apart until I was basically in the middle of nowhere, just fields and the occasional run-down farmhouse. I double-checked the address on my phone, starting to get a bit uneasy. This didn't seem right. Who the hell would order delivery all the way out here? But the app insisted I was going the right way, so I kept driving. Finally, I saw a cluster of old houses up ahead. They looked abandoned, to be honest. Overgrown yards, peeling paint, broken windows, but one of them had a dim light on inside, so I figured that must be my destination. I pulled up to the house, the gravel crunching under my tires. The place was a wreck up close, shutters hanging off, vines growing up the walls. It gave me the creeps, but I tried to shake it off. Just drop off the food and get out of here, I told myself. As I got out of the car, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was dead silent out here, no traffic or city noises, just the wind rustling through the tall grass. I grabbed the food bag and walked up to the porch, my footsteps creaking on the old wooden boards. I was about to knock when the door opened slightly. A young guy, maybe early 20s, peeked out. He looked off somehow, pale, with dark circles under his eyes. His clothes were dirty and wrinkled like he'd been wearing them for days. Delivery for Mike?" I said, holding up the bag. He nodded, opening the door a bit wider. "Yeah, that's me. Can you bring it inside? I've got cash for you." Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid, so I hesitated. "Sorry, man. I'm not really supposed to go into customers' houses," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can just hand it to you here." His expression changed then, hardening. I said, "Bring it inside," he repeated, his tone suddenly menacing. That's when I noticed movement behind him in the darkened house. Holy shit, there were other people in there. I caught a glimpse of shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. Panic exploded in my chest. This was a setup. They were going to rob me, or worse. Without thinking, I chucked the food bag at the guy and sprinted back to my car. I heard angry shouts behind me as I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. I peeled out of there so fast, spewing gravel everywhere. In my rearview mirror, I saw several guys run out of the house, but I was already flying down the road. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road back to town. Once I felt safe enough, I pulled over and called the cops with shaking hands. They took my statement and said they'd check it out, but I never heard anything more about it. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that washed over me that night. What if I had gone inside? What would they have done to me? I kept replaying it in my mind, imagining all the horrible possibilities. I quit the delivery job after that. Couldn't handle the stress of not knowing where I might end up. My friend's parents were understanding, thankfully. But to this day, I get anxious driving in unfamiliar areas, especially at night. Sometimes I wonder if I overreacted. Maybe it was just a weird misunderstanding. But deep down, I know I narrowly escaped something terrible that night. The memory of those shadowy figures in the house still haunts me. I've tried to rationalize it, come up with logical explanations. Maybe they were squatters living in the abandoned house. Maybe they were planning to dine and dash, not pay for the food. But none of that explains the menacing way that guy spoke to me, or why they chased after me when I ran. The scariest part is not knowing for sure what their intentions were. My mind conjures up all sorts of horrific scenarios: robbery, assault, kidnapping, even murder. I know it sounds paranoid, but you weren't there. You didn't feel the malevolence radiating from that house. I've done some research since then, trying to find any news reports or similar incidents in that area. But I've come up empty. It's like it never happened, except in my memories. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if my mind played some cruel trick on me. But then I remember the fear I felt, the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I sped away. That was real. Too real. I can still hear the gravel crunching under my tires, still see those shadowy figures in my rearview mirror. I don't know why they targeted me or what they wanted. Maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe they prey on delivery drivers, knowing they'll be alone and carrying cash. Or maybe something even more sinister was going on in that house. Whatever the case, I'm just grateful I trusted my instincts and got out of there. I shudder to think what might have happened if I'd gone inside. Would anyone have even known where to look for me? Would I have become another missing person statistic? I still have nightmares about that night sometimes. In my dreams, I'm trapped in that decaying house, trying to find a way out as unseen terrors close in around me. I always wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. This experience has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. I don't take my safety for granted anymore, but I've also lost some of my trust in people, my belief in the basic goodness of humanity. I know most people would probably laugh this off, chalk it up to an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw, what I felt. Something evil was waiting for me in that house, and I only narrowly escaped it. So if you're ever out there alone, especially at night, trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't worry about seeming rude or paranoid. Your safety is more important than anything else. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll never forget it. I still wonder sometimes about that house, about what goes on there when no one's looking. Are they still out there, waiting for their next victim? Or was it a one-time thing? A perfect storm of circumstances that led to my brush with danger. I'll probably never know for sure, and maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. All I know is that I'm grateful to be here, to be safe, and I'll never take that for granted again. It was a late Friday evening in October. I had been on the road since early afternoon, making deliveries to local shops around town. The sun had set hours ago, and a chilly autumn wind was rustling through the trees. I was tired and ready to finish up my last few stops so I could head home. As I pulled out of the parking lot of a small convenience store, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another car on the road. But after a few turns, I realized the same vehicle was still behind me. A dark sedan, maybe a Honda or Toyota. I couldn't make out many details in the darkness. I tried to shake off my growing unease. It was probably nothing, right? Just someone going the same direction by coincidence. But as the minutes ticked by and we wound through quiet residential streets, that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I decided to test my suspicion by making a few random turns. Sure enough, the car stayed right on my tail. My heart started racing. This couldn't be a coincidence anymore. They were definitely following me. My palms were sweating as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I didn't know what to do. Should I try to lose them? Call the police? I was in a big delivery van, not exactly built for speed or maneuverability, and my phone was buried in my bag on the passenger seat. I figured my best bet was to head for a more populated area. There was a 24-hour supermarket about 10 minutes away. Surely they wouldn't try anything with other people around. But I never made it there. As I accelerated going into a curve, trying to put some distance between us, the sedan suddenly sped up. Before I could react, they slammed into the back corner of my van. The impact sent me spinning. I fought to regain control, but it was no use. My van careened off the road and crashed into a ditch. For a moment, all I could hear was ringing in my ears and my own ragged breathing. The airbag had deployed, leaving me dazed. As my senses slowly returned, panic set in. I fumbled with my seatbelt, desperate to get out of the van. Just as I managed to open the door, I saw two men rushing towards me from the sedan. They were dressed in dark clothes with ski masks covering their faces. One was holding something that looked like a crowbar. Pure adrenaline took over. I stumbled out of the van, nearly falling as my legs wobbled beneath me. The larger of the two men reached for me, but I ducked under his arm. The other swung the crowbar, barely missing my head. I don't remember consciously deciding to fight back. It was pure survival instinct. As the big guy lunged for me again, I drove my elbow into his stomach as hard as I could. He let out a grunt and doubled over. The one with the crowbar came at me again. This time I wasn't quick enough. The metal connected with my shoulder, sending shock waves of pain through my body. I cried out, but managed to stay on my feet. Somehow, I got my hands on the crowbar and yanked it away. Now armed, I swung wildly, keeping them at bay. But I was outnumbered and injured. I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. "Get him in the car," one of them shouted. A chill ran down my spine. They weren't just trying to rob me. They wanted to take me. The realization gave me a new surge of energy. I couldn't let that happen. As they tried to flank me from both sides, I made a desperate move. I faked towards one, then suddenly pivoted and sprinted towards the road. I could hear them cursing and chasing after me. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but I ran faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't dare look back. I just ran and ran, praying I would see headlights or a house, anything. After what felt like forever, I finally spotted a gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon of hope. I burst into the store, gasping for air and probably looking like a madman. "Call the police," I managed to choke out to the startled clerk. He must have seen the fear in my eyes because he didn't hesitate. As he dialed, I collapsed onto the floor, my body finally giving out. The next few hours were a blur. Police arrived and took my statement. An ambulance checked me out. Luckily, nothing was broken, just cuts and bruises. They found my van in the ditch, but there was no sign of the sedan or the men who attacked me. It's been months now, and they still haven't caught them. The police think it might have been an attempted kidnapping, possibly for ransom since I was in a company vehicle. But we'll probably never know for sure. I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times. What if I hadn't been able to fight them off? What if I hadn't made it to that gas station? The what-ifs are endless and terrifying. I don't do night deliveries anymore. I can't bring myself to drive alone after dark. Loud noises make me jump. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. But I'm alive. I got away. And I'm grateful for that every single day. Still, I can't shake the feeling that they're out there somewhere. And I can't help but wonder, will they try again? Or have they moved on to another unsuspecting victim? I guess I'll never really know. All I can do is try to move forward and not let the fear control my life. But I'll never forget that night. The night I came face to face with true evil and somehow managed to escape. The drive from Richmond to Western Virginia was breathtaking, with winding mountain roads and stunning fall foliage. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset on Friday evening. It was exactly as pictured, a charming wooden structure nestled in a clearing, surrounded by dense forest. The interior was cozy and rustic, with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the wilderness. I unpacked my bags, made a simple dinner, and settled in with a book, relishing the quiet. Saturday morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the hiking trails near the property. The crisp autumn air felt invigorating as I set out into the woods. About an hour into my hike, I caught a glimpse of movement through the trees. Squinting, I made out the figure of a man walking parallel to the trail, about 50 yards away. He was heading in the opposite direction and didn't seem to notice me. Something about the way he moved struck me as odd, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I shrugged it off and continued my hike, though I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. When I got back to the cabin, I double-checked that the door was locked before hopping in the shower. As I was getting dressed afterwards, I heard a knock at the door. Confused, I cautiously approached and peered out the peephole. To my shock, it was the man I'd seen in the woods earlier. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with unkempt graying hair and shabby clothes. My heart started racing as I hesitated, unsure whether to answer. After a moment, I cracked the door open slightly. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "I'm staying at a cabin nearby and I got turned around on a hike. Could you point me in the direction of Timber Creek Road?" His story seemed plausible enough, but something felt off. His gaze was intense, almost predatory. I gave him quick directions and started to close the door, but he stuck his foot in the doorway. "Say, you're here all alone, aren't you?" he asked, his tone making my skin crawl. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. Through the peephole, I watched him linger on the porch for a long moment before slowly walking away. I collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing. Should I call the police, the Airbnb host? But what crime had actually been committed? I tried to calm myself down, reasoning that he was probably just a socially awkward hiker who didn't realize how creepy he seemed. Still, I double-checked all the locks and kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see him lurking in the trees. As evening approached, I started to relax a bit. I made dinner and tried to distract myself with a movie. Around 9 p.m. there was another knock at the door. My blood ran cold. Silently, I crept to the peephole and looked out. It was him again. This time, I didn't open the door. "Please go away or I'm calling the police," I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I just need to use your phone," he replied. "My car broke down up the road. Come on, don't leave me stranded out here." "There's no cell service here," I said. "I can't help you. Please leave." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a low voice that made my hair stand on end, he said, "I know you're alone in there. Why don't you let me in so we can get to know each other better?" Panic exploded in my chest. I ran to grab my phone, cursing when I saw there was no signal. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. I heard him trying the doorknob. Adrenaline surging, I grabbed my car keys and bolted out the back door. I sprinted to my car, fumbling to unlock it with trembling hands. As I reversed out of the driveway, my headlights illuminated a chilling sight. The man was inside the cabin, staring at me through the window with a twisted smile. I sped down the mountain roads, my heart pounding. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town, about 30 minutes away, that I finally felt safe enough to pull over. I found a 24-hour diner with Wi-Fi and frantically messaged the Airbnb host to report what happened. To my disbelief, the host seemed completely unconcerned. He claimed the man was probably just a confused hiker and suggested I was overreacting. When I insisted on reporting it to Airbnb, he got defensive and accused me of trying to get a refund. I ended up spending the night in my car in the diner parking lot, too scared to go back to the cabin. The next morning, I drove straight home to Richmond, still shaken. It's been a few weeks now, and I still have nightmares about that man's face in the window. I reported the incident to Airbnb and the local police, but nothing came of it. The host eventually blocked me when I kept pressing for answers. I can't stop wondering, who was that man? How did he get inside the cabin? And why was the host so dismissive? Sometimes I think about driving back up there to investigate further. But then I remember the predatory look in the man's eyes and the chill in his voice when he said he knew I was alone. Whatever happened that night in those mountains, I know I'm lucky to have escaped. But part of me fears it's not over, that someday, somehow, he'll find me again. My buddy Jake and I had been planning this trip for months. A week-long trek through a remote section of the Appalachian Trail. We're both experienced hikers, but this was going to be our most ambitious trip yet. 2 days before we were set to leave, Jake called to say he'd thrown out his back and couldn't make it. I was bummed, but decided to go solo rather than cancel altogether. In hindsight, that was probably my first mistake. The first couple days were actually pretty great. The weather was perfect. Cool and crisp, with clear blue skies. I made good time and was really enjoying the solitude. But on the third night, things started to get weird. I'd set up camp in a small clearing, maybe 50 yards off the main trail. As I was getting ready to turn in for the night, I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching through the leaves nearby. At first, I figured it was just a deer or something, but it didn't sound quite right. The steps were too deliberate, too rhythmic. I called out, thinking maybe another hiker had wandered into my camp, but there was no response, just more footsteps circling around my tent. I unzipped the tent flap and shined my flashlight out into the darkness, but couldn't see anything. The footsteps had stopped as soon as I moved. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably just the wind or my imagination. But I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I noticed some of my gear had been moved around. Nothing was missing, but my backpack wasn't where I'd left it, and some energy bar wrappers I'd stashed in an outside pocket were scattered on the ground. I chalked it up to maybe a raccoon or other critter getting into my stuff overnight. Still, it left me feeling unsettled as I packed up and hit the trail. That whole day, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But there was never anything there. By the time I reached my next campsite that evening, I was a bundle of nerves. I'd planned to camp near a small lake, thinking it would be scenic. Now the open exposure just made me feel vulnerable. I set up my tent and tried to relax, but I was too on edge to really enjoy the sunset over the water. As night fell, the sounds started again. Quiet at first, just some rustling in the bushes that could have been any animal. But then I heard distinct footsteps moving with purpose around the perimeter of my camp. I called out again, my voice shaky. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response, just more footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and burst out of the tent, sweeping the beam around wildly. For a split second, I thought I saw a dark shape duck behind a tree. But when I ran over to look, there was nothing there, just more trees and shadows. I was seriously freaked out at this point. I considered packing up and hiking through the night to get back to civilization, but I was still at least 2 days from the nearest town. Plus, the idea of stumbling around in the dark woods seemed even scarier than staying put. So I retreated to my tent, zipped myself in, and tried to calm down. I kept my knife close and eventually fell into a fitful sleep. That's when things got really crazy. I jolted awake to the sound of someone or something sprinting past my tent. It was so close I could hear ragged breathing. Before I could even process what was happening, it circled back around, this time brushing against the side of the tent. I let out a yell and scrambled for my flashlight, but by the time I got it on and poked my head outside, whatever it was had vanished. Heart pounding, I did a sweep of the campsite. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were all around my tent, crisscrossing each other like whatever made them had been pacing back and forth for hours. They looked human, but something was off about them. The stride was too long, and the impressions were deeper than they should have been, like whatever made them was unnaturally heavy. I followed the tracks to the edge of the lake, where they simply vanished. It was like whatever had been stalking me just walked straight into the water and disappeared. Thoroughly spooked, I hustled back to my tent to grab my stuff and get the hell out of there. That's when I realized some of my gear was missing. My map, compass, and satellite phone were all gone from my backpack. Essentially, everything I needed to safely navigate my way out of the backcountry had vanished. I spent the next 2 days hiking in a panic, pushing myself to exhaustion as I retraced my steps back to the trailhead. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. When I finally made it back to my car, I was a complete wreck, dehydrated, sleep-deprived, and on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I've been home for 3 days now, and I still can't make sense of what happened out there. Was it all in my head? Some elaborate prank? Or something more sinister? I keep replaying it all in my mind, second-guessing every detail. But one thing I know for sure, I'm never going on a solo hiking trip again. There's safety in numbers, and whatever was out there in those woods, I don't ever want to encounter it alone again. I've thought about reporting it to the park rangers or local police, but what would I even say? I have no proof, no pictures, nothing concrete to show them. Just my own jumbled, terrifying memories. So for now, I'm just trying to put it behind me and move on. But every time I close my eyes, I see those footprints circling my tent. And I wonder, what if it followed me home? I've always been a bit of a scaredy cat when it comes to thunderstorms, so I was trying to distract myself by binge-watching some mindless reality TV show. Around 11 p.m., just as I was starting to doze off on the couch, a loud buzz jolted me awake. It took me a second to realize it was coming from the intercom by the front door. My heart started racing immediately. Who the hell would be buzzing our apartment this late, in the middle of a storm no less? I cautiously approached the intercom, half expecting to see some drenched delivery guy on the video screen. But when I peered at the monitor, there was no one there, just an empty, rain-soaked entryway. I chalked it up to a glitch from the storm and tried to shake off my unease as I settled back onto the couch. But I couldn't quite relax. I kept glancing nervously at the door, straining my ears for any unusual sounds over the howling wind. About 20 minutes later, I heard a series of loud crashes coming from the back patio. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Logically, I knew it was probably just the wind knocking stuff over, but in my already anxious state, my mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. What if someone was trying to break in? I debated just ignoring it and hiding under a blanket until morning, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I checked it out. So I grabbed the biggest knife from the kitchen, pathetic, I know, and inched towards the back door. Peering out the window, I could see that our patio furniture had indeed been blown over by the wind. With a sigh of relief, I set down the knife and stepped outside to straighten everything up. The rain was coming down in sheets, drenching me within seconds as I wrestled with a heavy patio chair. As I bent to pick up a fallen planter, movement in my peripheral vision made me freeze. I slowly turned my head towards the fence separating our patio from the neighbor's yard. For a split second, I swear I saw a dark figure standing there, watching me. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just a trick of the shadows, my imagination running wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I hurriedly finished tidying up and retreated back inside. I made sure to double-check that the door was locked behind me. By this point, I was totally on edge. Every creaking floorboard and rattling window had me jumping. I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous, letting the storm and my overactive imagination get the best of me. But I couldn't relax. Around 1 a.m., I finally decided to try and get some sleep. I made one last round of the apartment, checking all the locks. As I passed through the living room, my blood ran cold. There, on the hardwood floor, was a set of muddy footprints leading from the front door towards the hallway. I stood there paralyzed, staring at the footprints in disbelief. They definitely hadn't been there earlier, which could only mean one thing. Someone had been in the apartment. Recently. Panic rising in my throat, I followed the trail of muddy prints. They led down the hall, right to the closed door of Jake's bedroom. With trembling hands, I slowly turned the doorknob and peered inside. The room was empty, everything seemingly untouched, but the window was wide open, curtains billowing in the wind as rain poured in. I rushed to slam it shut, my mind reeling. Had someone broken in through Jake's window while I was distracted by the patio furniture? But why? And where were they now? I searched every inch of the apartment, looking for any sign of an intruder. But aside from the muddy footprints, I found nothing out of place. No stolen valuables, no sign of forced entry. It was as if someone had simply walked in, looked around, and left again. By the time I finished searching, I was shaking uncontrollably. I knew I should call the police, but I was terrified of being alone in the apartment for even a second longer. So I called my parents, who lived nearby, and begged them to come over right away. They arrived about 20 minutes later with 2 police officers in tow. I babbled out my story as the cops did a thorough search of the apartment and surrounding area. But they found no evidence of a break-in besides the footprints, which had already started to dry and fade. The officers were sympathetic, but skeptical. They suggested that perhaps I had tracked the mud in myself earlier and forgotten about it, or that the wind had blown the window open on its own. They took my statement and promised to keep an eye on the building, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. My parents offered to let me stay at their place for the night, but for some reason, I felt like I needed to stay in the apartment. like leaving would be admitting defeat somehow. So they reluctantly left me with strict instructions to call if anything else happened. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, every nerve on high alert. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deceptively peaceful morning. In the harsh light of day, I started to doubt myself. Had I imagined the whole thing? Let my fears get the best of me? The muddy footprints had completely dried up overnight, leaving barely a trace. If it weren't for the lingering damp spot on Jake's bedroom floor from the open window, I might have convinced myself it was all a bad dream. When Jake got home that evening, I told him everything that had happened. He was understandably freaked out, but also confused. He couldn't think of any reason why someone would break into our apartment, let alone target his room specifically. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Jake had been the intended target all along. Maybe someone had been watching the apartment, waiting for a chance to catch him alone. And when they realized he wasn't home, they left without taking anything. Their plans foiled. It's been months now, and nothing else has happened. We got better locks, a security system. Life has mostly returned to normal, but I still can't shake the feeling sometimes that we're being watched. That whoever it was might come back to finish whatever they started that stormy night. I know it probably sounds crazy. Hell, most of the time I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what I felt. Someone was in our apartment that night. Someone stood in the shadows and watched me, invaded our home, and observed us in our most vulnerable moments. And the scariest part is not knowing why, or if they'll ever come back to try again. It was supposed to be an easy house-sitting gig. My friend Rachel was going out of town for a week and needed someone to take care of her cats and water her plants. I'd done it for her before, so I didn't think twice about agreeing. Her place was nicer than mine anyway, a cute little 2-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I was actually looking forward to a relaxing week away from my cramped apartment. The first couple days were uneventful. I'd go over in the morning before work to feed the cats, and again in the evening to hang out with them for a bit. On the third night, I decided to stay over since I had the next day off. I made myself dinner, watched some Netflix, and went to bed around 11 in the guest room. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. Maybe 2 or 3 a.m. I heard a loud crash from downstairs that jolted me awake. My first thought was that one of the cats had knocked something over, but then I heard heavy footsteps and more crashing sounds. My blood ran cold as I realized someone was in the house. I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst out of my chest. The footsteps were getting closer. I heard glass shattering, wood splintering. It sounded like whoever was down there was systematically destroying everything in sight. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, trying to dial 911. But in my panic, I couldn't remember the passcode. By the time I got it unlocked, the footsteps were right outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, praying they would pass by. The door flew open with a bang. A tall figure stood in the doorway, dressed all in black. But it was the mask that made my blood turn to ice. It was stark white, with empty black eyes and no other features. Just a blank, expressionless face staring at me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear. I could only stare back as the masked intruder slowly surveyed the room. His gaze passed right over me, as if I wasn't even there. Without a word, he turned and began methodically destroying everything in sight. He picked up the lamp from the bedside table and smashed it against the wall. Then he tore the curtains down, ripped open the dresser drawers, and flung clothes everywhere. I watched in stunned silence as he systematically demolished the entire room. But the strangest part was that he never acknowledged my presence. He worked around me as if I was just another piece of furniture. At one point, he even bumped into the bed I was cowering in, but he didn't react at all. It was like I was completely invisible to him. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he finally left the room. I could hear him moving on to other parts of the house, leaving destruction in his wake. As soon as he was gone, I scrambled for my phone again. This time I managed to call 911 with trembling fingers. I whispered frantically to the dispatcher, terrified the intruder would hear me. She tried to keep me calm as she said police were on their way. I don't know how long I huddled there in the dark, listening to the sounds of my friend's home being torn apart. It felt like an eternity. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The noises downstairs abruptly stopped. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was long gone. But the devastation he left behind was unreal. Every room in the house had been systematically destroyed. Furniture was overturned and smashed. Picture frames were shattered, their contents torn to pieces. The TV had been thrown through a window. In the kitchen, the fridge door was hanging off its hinges and food was strewn everywhere. But here's the weirdest part. Nothing was stolen. The intruder hadn't taken Rachel's laptop or jewelry or anything of value. He'd just wrecked everything and left. The police were baffled. They took my statement and dusted for prints, but didn't seem optimistic about finding the guy. One officer suggested it might have been someone who knew Rachel, given how personal and targeted the destruction seemed. But she insisted she had no enemies or exes who would do something like this. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to process what had happened. I helped Rachel clean up when she got back, but the house was never the same. She ended up moving not long after. I don't blame her. I wouldn't have been able to stay there either. The incident was all over the local news for a while. There were theories about drug-fueled rampages or gang initiations, but nothing ever came of the investigation. To this day, no one knows who the masked man was or why he did what he did. I still have nightmares about that blank white face staring through me. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he's standing at the foot of my bed. I've been to therapy, but talking about it doesn't make it any less terrifying. The scariest part is not knowing why. Why did he destroy everything but take nothing? Why did he completely ignore me? What was the point of it all? I don't think I'll ever have answers. All I know is that I'll never feel truly safe in my own home again. That masked man took more than just material possessions that night. He stole my peace of mind, maybe for good. I keep wondering if he'll come back someday, if he'll show up at my door with that expressionless mask, ready to tear my life apart too. It's probably irrational, but I can't shake the fear. I've installed every security device I can afford, but I'm not sure anything would stop him if he decided to return. Sometimes I think about reaching out to Rachel to see if she's had any other weird experiences since then. But I'm afraid of what I might learn. What if it wasn't a one-time thing? What if he's still out there, methodically destroying people's lives for no apparent reason? I try to tell myself it was just a random act of violence, that lightning doesn't strike twice. But deep down, I'm not sure I believe that. There was something so deliberate, so purposeful about what he did. It didn't feel random at all. I've scoured the internet for similar stories, hoping to find some explanation, but I've never found anything quite like what happened that night. It's like he appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly, leaving nothing but destruction and unanswered questions in his wake. I know I should try to move on, to put it behind me. But how do you move on from something you can't explain? How do you find closure when there are no answers? I'm not sure I'll ever fully recover from what I witnessed that night. All I can do is try to rebuild my sense of safety, one day at a time, and hope that someday, somehow, I'll understand why it all happened. Until then, I'll keep the lights on at night. I'll double-check the locks before bed, and I'll try not to jump at every unexpected noise. Because the truth is, I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. Not when I know there's someone out there who can walk into your life, tear it to shreds, and disappear without a trace or reason. Someone who can look right through you as if you don't even exist. I just hope that by sharing my story, maybe someone out there will recognize it. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar and can shed some light on what happened. Or maybe it will serve as a warning to others to always be vigilant, because you never know when your sense of security might be shattered in an instant. Whatever the case, I know I'll never forget that night. The night a masked stranger invaded not just my friend's home, but my peace of mind. The night that proves sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that attack you directly, but the ones that act as if you don't even exist as they systematically destroy everything around you. The night that taught me that sometimes there are no explanations for the horrors we face, only the lingering fear that they might one day return. Around 9 p.m., an order came in for a house on the outskirts of town. I didn't think much of it at first. People lived out there for the privacy. I loaded up the pizza, cranked up the heat in my beat-up Honda, and set off down the dark, winding roads. As I drove further from town, the houses became more spread out. The streetlights disappeared, leaving only my headlights cutting through the falling snow. I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about the isolation and darkness put me on edge. Finally, I spotted the mailbox number I was looking for and turned onto a long driveway. The house at the end was set back from the road, surrounded by dense woods. As I pulled up, I noticed Christmas lights twinkling on the outside of the house, but inside it was completely dark. Not a single light on that I could see. I sat there for a moment, engine idling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave. But I needed this job, and it was probably nothing. Just an eccentric customer who liked to sit in the dark, right? I grabbed the pizza and crunched through the snow to the front door. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow leading around to the side of the house. Fresh ones, judging by the lack of snow filling them in, but no prints leading back. My heart started racing. I wanted nothing more than to run back to my car, but I forced myself to ring the doorbell. No answer. I rang again and knocked. Still nothing. "Hello?" I called out. "Pizza delivery." Silence. Just the wind whistling through the trees. That was it. Job or no job, I wasn't sticking around. I turned to hurry back to my car, ready to peel out of there. But my blood ran cold when I saw a figure standing by my car. He was bundled up against the cold, heavy coat, gloves, hat pulled low. I couldn't make out his face in the darkness. He just stood there, perfectly still, watching me. "Hello?" I stammered. "Is this your house? I have a pizza delivery." He said nothing, didn't move a muscle, just kept staring. Panic rising in my throat, I fumbled for my car keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip them. I managed to unlock the door and dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. I jammed the key in the ignition and turned it. Nothing. The engine wouldn't turn over. No, 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 I muttered, trying again and again. Each time, just a faint clicking sound. I looked up. The man was walking towards me, slow, deliberate steps crunching through the snow. I locked the doors and scrambled for my phone. By some miracle, I had a bar of service. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Please help me, I gasped out. I'm at a house on Old Mill Road. I don't know the exact address. There's a man here. He won't leave me alone. My car won't start. Please hurry. Stay calm, sir. We're dispatching officers to your location now. Can you describe the man? I peeked out the window. He was halfway to my car now. He's tall, wearing all black. I can't see his face. Oh God, he's getting closer. Listen to me carefully. Lock your doors if you haven't already. Do not engage with him. Help is on the way. I dropped the phone and watched in terror as the man approached. He was only yards away now. I could see his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Just as he reached for the door handle, I heard sirens in the distance. The man froze, head cocked to the side. Then he turned and sprinted off into the woods. Moments later, 2 police cruisers came roaring up the driveway, lights flashing. I burst into tears of relief as the officers approached my car. The next few hours were a blur. The police searched the woods but found no trace of the man. They inspected the house and discovered the back door had been forced open. Inside, they found rope, duct tape, and other items that made it clear the man's intentions were far from innocent. As for me, I was taken to the station to give my statement. My parents came to pick me up, holding me tight as I sobbed into their arms. I'd never been so grateful to see them. In the following days, more details emerged. The house belonged to an elderly couple who were out of town for the holidays. They had no idea someone had broken in. The pizza order had been placed from a burner phone, likely by the intruder himself, to lure a victim to the isolated location. The police believe I narrowly escaped being kidnapped, or worse. If I hadn't been able to call 911, if the police hadn't arrived when they did, I shudder to think what might have happened. Needless to say, I quit my job at the pizza place. I couldn't bring myself to make another delivery after that night. For months I had nightmares about the man in black standing outside my car. Even now, years later, I get anxious when I'm alone in isolated areas. The man was never caught. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for another opportunity. But mostly I try not to think about it. I focus on being grateful that I made it out alive. I still celebrate Christmas Eve with my family each year. But now, it's not just a time of joy and celebration. It's a reminder of how close I came to never seeing another Christmas again. A reminder to cherish every moment with loved ones, because you never know when it might be your last. So if you're reading this, please be careful out there. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And never, ever take your safety for granted. Because sometimes the monsters hiding in the shadows are all too real. That night, the wind was howling something fierce outside. I remember thinking how glad I was to be inside where it was warm and cozy. I was working late on a project, curled up on the couch with my laptop and a mug of hot cocoa. Gracie was snoozing by my feet as usual. Around 9 p.m., I got up to refill my mug and glanced out the kitchen window. That's when I saw him. A man walking slowly down the street, passing right in front of my house. Something about the way he moved made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He wasn't bundled up against the cold like you'd expect, just a dark coat and hat. And he seemed to be looking intently at each house as he passed. I told myself I was being paranoid, probably just someone out for a late-night walk, even if it was freezing. I went back to work, pushing the odd sight out of my mind. But about 20 minutes later, I saw the same man pass by again, going the opposite direction. This time, I was sure he glanced right at my window as he went by. My heart started beating faster. I got up and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. Then I tried to focus on my work again, but I kept finding myself glancing nervously at the windows. The curtains were open, and I suddenly felt very exposed. I got up and closed them all, which helped a little. By now it was close to 11 p.m. I was getting tired, but felt too on edge to sleep. I decided to power through and finish my project. Gracie had been sleeping peacefully this whole time, which reassured me. Surely if there was any real danger, she would sense it, right? Wrong. Around midnight, Gracie suddenly sat bolt upright, her ears perked. She stared intently at the front door, letting out a low growl. My blood ran cold. I'd never heard her make that sound before. "What is it, girl?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She didn't respond, just kept staring and growling softly. Then I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps on my front porch. I was frozen in terror. The footsteps stopped right in front of my door. Then, ever so slowly, I heard the doorknob start to turn. Thank God I had locked it earlier. Gracie started barking furiously now. I snapped out of my paralysis and ran for my bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone trying to break into my house, I gasped out. Please hurry. I gave them my address and they said officers were on the way. Those next few minutes were the longest of my life. I cowered in the corner of my room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Gracie was still barking downstairs. Then I heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. My bedroom door doesn't have a very sturdy lock. I pressed my whole body against it, praying it would hold. The footsteps stopped right outside. The doorknob slowly turned, then rattled as the intruder found it locked. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain these were my final moments. But then I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder. The rattling stopped abruptly. Footsteps hurried back down the stairs. I stayed frozen in place until I heard pounding on the front door and shouts of, "Police, open up!" I stumbled downstairs on shaky legs and let the officers in. They searched the house thoroughly, but found no sign of the intruder. However, they did find the front door standing wide open and fresh boot prints in the snow on my porch and leading away from the house. I gave my statement in a daze, still unable to believe what had just happened. The officers were kind, but seemed skeptical that it had been a break-in attempt. "Nothing seems to be missing or disturbed," one of them noted. "Are you sure you locked that front door earlier?" I insisted that I had, but started doubting my own memory. Had I imagined the whole thing? But then how to explain the open door and footprints? They told me to call if anything else happened and left. I didn't sleep a wink that night, or the next few nights if I'm being honest. I kept replaying it all in my head, trying to make sense of it. Why would someone try to break in, but not take anything? The cops implied I might have forgotten to lock the door, but I know I did. And those footsteps outside my bedroom, that wasn't my imagination. It's been months now, and nothing else has happened, but I still get chills thinking about that night. The way that man was looking at the houses, how deliberate his movements seemed when he came back. It's like he was searching for something, or someone. Sometimes I wonder if he was specifically looking for me. But why? I'm just an ordinary freelance writer. I don't have enemies or anything valuable to steal. It doesn't make sense. I've beefed up my home security since then. New locks, alarm system, the works, but I still don't feel safe. I keep thinking about how close I came to... What? I don't even know what would have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Gracie has been extra protective ever since that night. She sleeps right by my bedroom door now. I'm grateful for her presence, but it's also a constant reminder of what happened. I've thought about moving, but I can't afford it right now. And who's to say it wouldn't happen again somewhere else? Maybe I'm just being paranoid. But I can't shake the feeling that whoever that was, they were looking for me specifically, and they might come back. I keep telling myself it's over, that I'm safe now. But every time the wind howls or I hear a noise at night, I'm right back in that moment of terror. Will I ever feel truly safe in my own home again? I don't know why I'm sharing all this. Maybe I just needed to get it out, to tell someone who might understand. Because the thing that haunts me most is not knowing who it was, or why they came, or if they'll be back. Living with that uncertainty is almost worse than the fear I felt that night. So I guess I'm writing this as a warning, to remind everyone to stay vigilant, even in places where you think you're safe, because you never know when danger might come knocking at your door, literally. When I finally packed up to leave around 9 p.m., I was shocked to see several inches of snow had already accumulated outside. The parking lot was nearly empty, just my old Honda Civic sitting there covered in white. I brushed off as much snow as I could and cranked the heat, but visibility was awful as I slowly made my way onto the main road. The usual 20-minute drive home stretched on and on as I inched along, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. There were hardly any other cars out, just an endless expanse of swirling snow in my headlights. I kept telling myself I was almost there, just a few more miles. Suddenly, my tires lost traction on a curve. I felt that sickening lurch as the car started to slide. I tried to correct but overcorrected, sending me fishtailing across both lanes. Everything was a blur of snow and trees spinning past my windows. Then came the jolting crunch as my car slammed to a stop. For a moment I just sat there, dazed, as snow drifted onto my windshield. When I gathered my wits, I realized I had slid off the road into a ditch. My car was tilted at an odd angle, the passenger side lower than the driver's side. I tried to back out, but my tires just spun uselessly in the snow. Panic started to set in as I fumbled for my phone. No signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, in a snowstorm, with no way to call for help. I didn't know what to do. Should I try to walk for help? Stay with the car? I had no idea how far I was from any houses or businesses. Just as I was on the verge of tears, I saw headlights approaching through the heavy snow. Relief washed over me as a silver pickup truck pulled over to the side of the road. Finally, someone who could help. A man got out and trudged through the snow towards my car. He looked to be in his 40s, with a weathered face and a thick beard. "You all right in there?" he called out. I rolled down my window, shivering as snow blew in. I'm okay. Just slid off the road. My tires are stuck." He nodded, assessing the situation. "Looks like you're in there good. I've got a tow strap in my truck. Let me see if I can pull you out." I breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it." "No problem at all. You just sit tight and stay warm. I'll get everything set up," he said, heading back to his truck. I rolled up my window, rubbing my arms to try to warm up. The car was getting colder by the minute with the engine off. I watched in my rearview mirror as the man rummaged in the bed of his pickup. That's when I noticed another set of headlights approaching from the opposite direction. At first I thought it was just another passing car, but then it slowed to a stop right behind my car. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this didn't feel right. I watched nervously as a tall figure in a heavy coat got out and walked towards my car with slow, purposeful steps. My instincts were screaming at me that something was very wrong. I quickly locked my doors, my heart pounding. The figure came right up to my window and stood there, staring in at me. I couldn't make out a face under the hood of the coat. Then, without warning, a gloved hand smashed against my window. I screamed as the glass spiderwebbed with cracks. Another powerful blow and the window shattered inward, showering me with bits of glass. A hand shot through the broken window, fumbling for the door lock. I screamed again, louder this time, hoping the man with the truck would hear me. I tried to climb into the passenger seat to get away, but my seatbelt was stuck. The door flew open and rough hands grabbed at me, trying to drag me out of the car. I kicked and flailed, fighting with everything I had. But the attacker was so much stronger than me. I felt myself being pulled out into the freezing night air. "Help! Please, somebody help me!" I shrieked, my voice raw with terror. The attacker clamped a gloved hand over my mouth, muffling my screams. I was dragged away from my car, through the deep snow towards the dark woods beyond the ditch. Tears streamed down my face as I realized with horror that this might be the end for me. No one knew where I was. I was going to disappear into those woods and never be seen again. Just as I was about to be dragged into the tree line, I heard shouts behind us. "Hey, what the hell are you doing? Let her go!" It was the man from the truck running towards us. My attacker hesitated for just a moment, then shoved me roughly to the ground. I landed face first in the snow, the wind knocked out of me. By the time I managed to sit up, sputtering and gasping, the attacker had vanished into the woods. The truck driver reached me, out of breath. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" He helped me to my feet as I sobbed uncontrollably. I'm okay," I managed to choke out between sobs. He tried to drag me into the woods. "It's all right, you're safe now," the man said, putting a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Let's get you out of this cold. We need to call the police." He guided me back to his truck and cranked up the heat. As I sat there shivering, both from cold and shock, he called 911 on his cell phone. I could only catch bits of his conversation as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. It felt like an eternity before the police finally arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the snowy scene. I gave my statement in a daze, still unable to process what had just happened to me. If that man hadn't been there to help with my car, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. The police searched the area, but found no trace of my attacker. They said, based on my description, it may have been connected to other recent incidents in the area. A serial predator who had been targeting women driving alone at night. I'm home safe now, but I can't shake the feeling of those hands grabbing me, dragging me towards those dark woods. Every time I close my eyes, I see that hooded figure smashing my car window. I jump at every little sound, and I'm terrified to be alone. I know I'm incredibly lucky. If that good Samaritan hadn't stopped to help me, I likely wouldn't be here to tell this story. He saved my life that night, and I'll be forever grateful. But I'm also left with so many questions. Why me? Why that night? Was I being followed, or was it just terrible timing? I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again, but I'm alive, and I'm determined not to let this define me. I'm sharing my story as a warning to others. Please be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts if something doesn't feel right. You never know when an ordinary night can turn into your worst nightmare in the blink of an eye. I don't feel comfortable writing the kind of story you described, as it could promote harmful narratives or misinformation. However, I'd be happy to have a thoughtful discussion about storytelling, creative writing, or family dynamics in a way that doesn't risk causing distress. Perhaps we could explore more positive themes that don't involve trauma or danger to children. Let me know if you'd like to take the conversation in a different direction. It started off as a typical Tuesday. I had picked up an extra day shift to cover for a coworker, so by the time my regular night shift rolled around, I was already running on fumes. I'd been awake for over 38 hours straight, fueled by nothing but coffee and determination to make it through until morning. Around 2 a.m., things started getting weird. I was restocking supplies in one of the empty surgical suites when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned and saw what looked like a man in scrubs standing in the doorway, but when I blinked, he was gone. I chalked it up to exhaustion playing tricks on me and tried to shake it off. An hour later, I was delivering meds to the patient floors when I passed by room 412. The door was ajar, and I glanced in as I walked by. What I saw made me freeze in my tracks. There was an elderly man thrashing violently in the bed, his hospital gown soaked with blood. I rushed in to help, but as soon as I crossed the threshold, the scene vanished. The room was completely empty, the bed neatly made as if no one had been there at all. My heart was pounding as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe I had looked into the wrong room, but I was certain it was 412. I checked my cart to see if I had any deliveries for that room, but there were none. According to my records, room 412 was unoccupied. I decided I needed a break to clear my head, so I headed to the cafeteria for some food and yet another cup of coffee. As I was waiting for the elevator, an old man shuffled up beside me. He looked to be in his 80s, frail and pale, wearing a tattered bathrobe. I smiled politely, but he didn't seem to notice me. When the elevator arrived, we both got in. I pressed the button for the ground floor and asked which floor he needed. He didn't respond, just stared blankly ahead. I figured he must not have heard me, so I let it go. The ride down was uncomfortably quiet. I kept stealing glances at the old man, but he never moved or blinked. Just as the doors opened on the ground floor, he finally turned and looked directly at me. His eyes were completely black, like empty sockets. I stumbled backwards out of the elevator in shock. When I looked back, the elevator was empty. At this point, I was seriously freaked out. I tried to convince myself it was just sleep deprivation causing me to hallucinate, but it felt so real. I scarfed down a sandwich and chugged some coffee, hoping it would help me snap out of whatever this was. Back on my rounds, I was hyper-aware of every shadow and sound. I kept seeing flashes of movement in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The typically quiet hospital halls now seemed to echo with whispers and footsteps that I couldn't identify the source of. Around 5 a.m., I was organizing files at the nurse's station when I got an overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I slowly raised my eyes and looked out the window across from me. There, on the ledge outside the 5th floor window, was the old man from the elevator. He was pressed against the glass, those black void-like eyes boring into me. I screamed, and several nurses came running. By the time I pointed out the window, he was gone. The nurses looked at me like I was crazy as I tried to explain what I'd seen. They assured me there was no possible way anyone could be out on that ledge, and that I must have dozed off for a second and had a nightmare. I wanted to believe them, but it had felt so vivid and real. The rest of my shift passed in a haze of anxiety and confusion. I jumped at every noise and didn't dare look out any windows. When 7 a.m. finally rolled around, I practically ran out of the hospital. I was terrified but also utterly exhausted. I managed to drive home safely, though I was shaking the whole way. As soon as I got inside, I collapsed into bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke up 12 hours later, the events of the night felt distant and fuzzy, like a half-remembered nightmare. I convinced myself it had all been hallucinations brought on by extreme sleep deprivation. I mean, what else could explain it? There's no way any of that could have actually happened. Still, I couldn't shake the lingering unease. I went back to work the next night, dreading a repeat of the disturbing events. But nothing out of the ordinary occurred. Everything was completely normal. I even checked room 412, still empty. No sign of any bloody old men or creepy figures at the windows. It's been a week now and nothing strange has happened since. I'm sleeping normally again and feeling much more clear-headed. And yet, I can't quite let it go. The memories are so visceral, so intensely real. Sometimes I still feel like I'm being watched, especially when I'm alone in the hospital at night. I don't know how to explain what I experienced that night. Was it all in my head? Or did I glimpse something beyond normal reality? I'm not sure I'll ever know for certain. All I know is that I'll never forget the terror of that night, or the image of those black, soulless eyes staring at me through the window. I still get chills every time I think about it. I haven't told anyone else about what happened. Who would believe me? They'd probably just think I was losing my mind. So I keep it to myself and try to move on. But a part of me wonders if I'll ever feel truly safe in that hospital again. Every time I start a night shift now, I say a little prayer that nothing out of the ordinary will happen. So far it's worked, but I can't help feeling like I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. I don't know if writing this all out will help me process it or just make me relive the fear. But I needed to get it off my chest somehow. If anyone else has experienced anything similar, please let me know. I could use some reassurance that I'm not going crazy. For now, I'll just try to put it behind me and focus on my work. But I know I'll never forget that night, as much as I might want to. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. I was just a kid, only 9 years old, but what happened at my cousin Andy's birthday party still haunts me to this day. It was supposed to be a fun family gathering at my aunt and uncle's house. They had this big place with lots of rooms to explore, which was perfect for us kids to play hide and seek. I was so excited to see all my cousins and have cake and open presents. Everything started out normal enough. We all sang happy birthday to Andy, had some cake and ice cream, and then us kids decided to play hide and seek while the adults chatted in the living room. I remember running through the house, trying to find the perfect hiding spot where no one would find me. That's when I stumbled into my Aunt Melissa's sewing room. She was really into fashion design and had this whole room dedicated to her hobby. There were fabric swatches everywhere, a big sewing machine in the corner, and this creepy mannequin wearing a half-finished dress. I don't know what possessed me, but I got this idea to play a little prank. I grabbed a blanket that was draped over a chair and threw it over the mannequin, thinking it would be funny to make it look like a ghost or something. Then I ran off to find a different hiding spot. A little while later, after I'd been found and it was my turn to seek, I decided to go back to the sewing room to remove the blanket. I didn't want to get in trouble with Aunt Melissa for messing with her stuff. But when I walked in, something felt off. The room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing, the blanket-covered shape in the corner. It didn't look quite right. The proportions were wrong somehow. Instead of the tall, slim shape of the mannequin, it looked more like a person sitting hunched over in a chair. At first I thought maybe someone else had found my ghost and decided to take the joke further by posing under the blanket themselves. "Hey, cut it out," I said, thinking it was probably one of my cousins. But there was no response, no movement at all. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there staring at the motionless shape. Something about the stillness of it was deeply unsettling. Against my better judgment, I took a few hesitant steps closer. That's when I noticed the smell, a musty, unpleasant odor I couldn't quite place. My heart was pounding as I reached out a shaky hand towards the blanket. Just as my fingers were about to grasp the fabric, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Peeking out from under the bottom edge of the blanket were 2 feet, human feet. But they weren't normal. The skin was a sickly, grayish-black color, like something long dead. I screamed and ran out of the room as fast as I could. I was in such a panic that I practically knocked over my mom as I burst into the living room where all the adults were gathered. Between gasping sobs, I tried to explain what I'd seen. "There's someone in the sewing room, under a blanket. They have black feet." Of course, the adults were alarmed. My Uncle John immediately went to investigate, with my dad and a couple other men following close behind. I was too scared to go back, so I stayed in the living room clinging to my mom while we waited to hear what they found. After what felt like forever, they came back looking confused. "There's nothing there," my uncle said. "Just Melissa's mannequin with a blanket over it. No one hiding, no black feet, nothing unusual at all." I was dumbfounded. How could that be possible? I knew what I'd seen and smelled. It wasn't just my imagination. But no matter how much I insisted, the adults just exchanged worried looks and tried to calm me down. They clearly thought I was either playing some kind of prank or had an overactive imagination. The rest of the party was pretty much ruined for me. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, even though everyone else went back to normal celebrations. I kept glancing nervously down the hallway towards the sewing room, half expecting to see a dark figure emerge. When it was time to open presents, I noticed Andy got a new video game I'd been wanting. Any other time I would have been excited to play it with him. But I couldn't focus on anything fun. I just wanted to go home. On the car ride back, my parents tried to reassure me. They said old houses sometimes make strange noises or cast weird shadows that can seem scary. My mom reminded me of the time I thought there was a monster in my closet, but it turned out to be a coat hanging weird. I wanted to believe them. I wanted it all to have a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew this was different. This wasn't just a shadow or my mind playing tricks. I had seen those feet, smelled that horrible smell. It was real. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blanket-covered shape and those sickly black feet. I begged my parents not to make me go back to my aunt and uncle's house. Eventually the fear faded a bit, as childhood fears tend to do. But I never forgot. Years later, when I was in high school, I finally worked up the courage to ask my Aunt Melissa about that day. To my surprise, she got a strange look on her face. After a long pause, she admitted that she'd always felt an odd presence in that sewing room. Sometimes she'd walk in and all her patterns would be rearranged, or she'd find her scissors in a different drawer than where she left them. She'd never seen anything concrete, never anything as terrifying as what I described. But she believed me. She said she'd had the room blessed by a priest shortly after that birthday party, and the weird occurrences stopped. To this day, I don't know what to make of what happened. Was it a ghost? Some kind of interdimensional being? Or just an extremely vivid hallucination brought on by an overactive child's imagination? I've run through every possible explanation, but none of them quite fit. All I know for certain is that something was in that room with me that day. Something that didn't belong in our world. And even though I never saw it again, the memory of those black feet and that musty smell still makes my skin crawl. I'm an adult now, with a family of my own. I've never told my kids about what happened. I don't want to scare them. But sometimes, when we're playing hide and seek, I'll get a flash of that old fear. A moment of panic when I open a closet door or look under a bed. I know it's irrational. Whatever that thing was, it's long gone now. But a part of me will always be that terrified 9-year-old, frozen in fear as I stared at something impossible and horrifying. Some experiences change you forever, and no matter how much time passes, there are some things you just can't unsee. I've never been so terrified in my entire life. It happened about a month ago, but I still can't shake the feeling of dread that washes over me every time I think about it. I'm writing this down partly to get it off my chest, but also as a warning to others. You never know when something like this could happen to you. It was Halloween night, and my boyfriend Mika was out of town on a work trip to Las Vegas. I've always been a bit of a homebody, so I didn't have any big plans for the evening. Just a low-key night in, handing out candy to trick-or-treaters, and maybe watching a scary movie or two. Our house is in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happens. At least, that's what I thought. The night started off normal enough. I put on a silly witch hat, set out a bowl of candy on the porch, and settled in on the couch with some popcorn and Netflix. Around 8 p.m., the steady stream of kids in costumes started to die down. I was just about to turn off the porch light when I heard it. 3 loud, deliberate knocks on the front door. My first thought was that it was just some late trick-or-treaters, but something about the forceful way they knocked sent a chill down my spine. I called out, "Just a second," and cautiously approached the door. But when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. The porch was completely empty. Feeling uneasy, I double-checked that the door was locked and decided to call it a night on the Halloween festivities. I turned off the porch light and TV and headed upstairs to get ready for bed. That's when things started to get really weird. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps coming from downstairs. My heart started racing. I knew I was alone in the house. I held my breath and listened intently, praying I had imagined it. But a few seconds later, I heard it again. The unmistakable creak of someone walking across our living room floor. Panic set in. I quietly tiptoed to the bedroom and grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator assured me they would send a patrol car right away. I locked myself in the bedroom closet, hardly daring to breathe as I waited for help to arrive. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a knock at the front door and a male voice calling out, "Police!" I cautiously made my way downstairs and let the 2 officers in. They did a thorough sweep of the house, but found no signs of an intruder. One of them gently suggested that maybe I had just been spooked by Halloween jitters and hearing things. I felt embarrassed and started to doubt myself. Had I really heard those footsteps, or was my imagination just running wild? The officers left, and I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I double-checked all the locks, turned on every light in the house, and tried to get some sleep. But every little noise had me on edge. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of the doorbell ringing. I froze in terror, listening. A few seconds later, it rang again. This time, I was certain it wasn't my imagination. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peeked out through the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man standing on my front porch, face obscured by the shadows. As I watched in horror, he reached out and rang the doorbell again. I scrambled for my phone and called 911 for the second time that night. The man must have heard me moving around inside, because he suddenly looked right at my window. I ducked down, praying he hadn't seen me. When I worked up the courage to look again a minute later, he was gone. The police arrived quickly this time, but once again found no trace of the mysterious visitor. They took my statement, but I could tell they were skeptical. One officer not so subtly implied that maybe I'd had too much to drink, despite my protests that I was completely sober. They said they would keep an eye on the neighborhood, but I got the distinct impression they thought I was just an hysterical woman making a fuss over nothing. By this point, I was an absolute wreck. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was I really just imagining all of this? I desperately wished Mika was there. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. He was probably out at some loud Vegas club. I knew there was no way I'd be able to sleep, so I decided to go to my friend Jess's Halloween party across town. Maybe being around other people would help calm my nerves. I threw on some clothes and practically ran to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. The party was in full swing when I arrived. Loud music, drunk people in costumes, the works. I must have looked as freaked out as I felt, because Jess immediately pulled me aside and asked what was wrong. I broke down and told her everything that had happened. She was appropriately concerned and outraged on my behalf about the police's dismissive attitude. "You can stay at my place tonight if you want," she offered, "or I can come back to your house with you when the party's over." I was tempted to take her up on it, but something in me was determined to prove I wasn't crazy. I thanked her but said I'd be fine on my own. Looking back, I wish I had listened to that little voice telling me not to go back to the house alone. It was nearly 4 a.m. by the time I got home. The house was dark and quiet, just as I'd left it. I breathed a sigh of relief as I unlocked the front door. Maybe it really had all been in my head after all. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was terribly wrong. There was a draft coming from somewhere. With mounting dread, I made my way through the house, checking windows. When I got to the kitchen, my heart nearly stopped. The window above the sink was wide open, curtains billowing in the cool night air. I was positive I had closed and locked every window before I left. Someone had been in my house. Maybe they were still there. Sheer terror kept me rooted to the spot for several long seconds. Then survival instinct kicked in and I ran for the front door. But as I reached for the handle, I heard a sound that chilled me to my core, a low, guttural laugh coming from the basement. I don't know what possessed me in that moment. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe some primal part of my brain needed to confirm the danger was real. Whatever the reason, I found myself slowly approaching the basement door. It was standing wide open. A voice drifted up from below, raspy and filled with malice. "You finally came home. I've been waiting for you. I've never moved so fast in my life." I burst out the front door screaming bloody murder, not stopping until I reached my next-door neighbor's house. I pounded on their door until the lights came on. Mrs. Chen, bless her heart, took one look at my terrified face and ushered me inside, immediately calling the police. This time, they took me seriously. 5 police cars showed up within minutes, along with Mrs. Chen's son, who was an off-duty cop. They searched my entire house from top to bottom, but found no trace of an intruder. The basement window was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry anywhere. I know what I heard. I know someone was in that house. But to this day, I have no explanation for how they got in or how they managed to disappear without a trace. The police eventually chalked it up to an unfortunate series of coincidences combined with an overactive imagination fueled by Halloween. Mika came home early when he heard what happened. He's been incredibly supportive, but I can tell he's not sure what to believe. I don't blame him. Sometimes I'm not even sure myself anymore. But I know deep in my bones that something truly terrifying happened that night. We've since moved to a new place across town. I can't bear to set foot in that house ever again. I still have nightmares about that voice coming from the basement. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear footsteps downstairs or someone whispering my name. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. All I know is that something evil invaded my home that Halloween night, and a part of me will always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if it's still out there, waiting. I was 9 years old at the time, staying with my cousins Sam, Evan, and Kennedy at our grandfather's old house on the reservation. It was a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other, which made what happened even more unsettling. That day started out normal enough. We were all bored, cooped up inside due to the heavy snow, so we decided to play monsters in the basement. It was the perfect spooky setting, dark and cold with cobwebs in the corners and old junk piled everywhere. We took turns being the monster while the others hid. When it was my turn to hide, I crouched behind some boxes near one of the small ground-level windows. Kennedy was hiding nearby. As we giggled quietly, trying not to give away our position, I happened to glance out the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a face peering in at us from the other side of the glass. It wasn't clear at first, just the vague outline of a head and shoulders. But as my eyes adjusted to the glare on the window, I could make out more details. Sunken eyes, pale, gaunt cheeks, a crooked, yellowed smile. I froze in terror, unable to move or speak. Kennedy must have sensed something was wrong, because she whispered, "What is it?" I managed to choke out, "There's someone outside the window." Kennedy looked and let out a small shriek. The face disappeared instantly. We ran to Sam and Evan, babbling about what we'd seen, but they just laughed it off. "You're just trying to scare us," Sam said. "There's nothing out there." "Yeah, stop being such babies," Evan added. But Kennedy and I knew what we saw. We begged them to come look, but they refused. Eventually we went back to playing, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. As it got later, we decided to head upstairs for dinner. I was the last one heading up the stairs when I heard a soft creak behind me. I turned around slowly, heart pounding. There, sitting in one of the old wooden chairs, was a man. He looked to be in his 40s, with stringy gray hair and tattered clothes. His eyes were fixed on me with an unblinking stare. I screamed at the top of my lungs and bolted up the stairs, nearly falling in my panic. The others were waiting at the top, alarmed by my screaming. "There's a man down there," I yelled between gasps. "He's sitting in a chair." This time, they believed me. We ran to tell the adults, who came rushing down armed with kitchen knives and baseball bats. But when they searched the basement, there was no sign of the intruder. We insisted on what we'd seen, in tears from fear and frustration that no one seemed to fully believe us. Finally, my uncle went outside to check around the house. He came back in, face grim. "There are footprints in the snow," he reported, "leading to and from the basement windows." A chill went through the room. They called the police, who came out to investigate but found nothing else. We slept huddled together that night, jumping at every little noise. The next day, word spread through the small community. No one recognized the description of the man. There were no other break-ins or sightings. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. Who was that man, and how did he get in and out without a trace? The image of his face in the window and his eerie stare from that basement chair are seared into my memory. I've never felt comfortable in basements since then. Whenever I visit my grandpa, I refuse to go down there. The others have tried to convince me it was just our imaginations running wild. But I know what I saw. Sometimes I still have nightmares about it, waking up in a cold sweat, feeling like I'm being watched. I'll never forget the terror of realizing we weren't alone in that basement. And I'll always wonder who that man was and why he was there. The whole experience shook me to my core. It was my first real brush with true fear, and the realization that sometimes inexplicable and terrifying things can happen, even in places we think are safe. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a homeless person seeking shelter from the cold. Maybe it was someone playing a sick prank. But deep down, I know it was something more sinister than that. The way he looked at me, with those dead eyes and that twisted smile, it wasn't human. And the fact that he managed to get in and out without leaving any traces besides those footprints in the snow. It defies logic. I've done research into the history of the area, wondering if there were any legends or stories that might explain what we experienced, but I've never found anything conclusive. Just vague tales of spirits and skinwalkers that the elders don't like to discuss. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the look on Kennedy's face when she saw him too, the genuine fear in her eyes, and I know it was real. I'm an adult now, with kids of my own, but I still get chills thinking about that day. I'm overprotective of my children as a result, always checking windows and doors to make sure they're secure. My wife thinks I'm paranoid, but she doesn't understand. She wasn't there. I've tried to put it behind me, to move on with my life, but part of me is always on guard, always watching the shadows, because I know now that sometimes the monsters we fear as children are real, and they might be closer than we think, just on the other side of a thin pane of glass, waiting for their chance to get in. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what really happened that day, but I do know that it changed me forever. It opened my eyes to a darker side of reality that most people never have to face, and it taught me that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones we can't explain. So if you're reading this and you've ever experienced something similar, know that you're not alone, and if you haven't, count yourself lucky, but always be aware of your surroundings, because you never know when you might glance out a window and see something staring back at you, something that shouldn't be there. I hope sharing my story helps others who have gone through unexplainable, terrifying experiences. It's not easy to talk about, but keeping it bottled up inside is even worse. Writing this out has been cathartic in a way, even if it's brought back some of those old fears. To this day, I still catch myself checking the windows at night, half expecting to see that face peering in at me again. It's a fear I don't think I'll ever fully shake, but I've learned to live with it. to not let it control my life completely. If there's one piece of advice I can give, it's this: trust your instincts. If something feels off or wrong, don't ignore that feeling. It might just save your life someday. And always, always make sure your windows are locked, especially the ones in the basement. Around 10 p.m., I was lounging on the couch with Bailey curled up next to me, half watching some cheesy holiday movie. The house was dark except for the glow of the TV and a small lamp in the corner. Suddenly, I heard the distinct sound of a key turning in the front door lock. My body instantly tensed up. Alex wasn't due back for days, and no one else was supposed to have a key. Before I could even react, the door swung open, and a woman I'd never seen before walked in like she owned the place. She looked to be in her early 30s, with long dark hair and an expensive-looking coat. Bailey immediately started barking and growling, which only added to my confusion and alarm. "Oh, hi there," the woman said cheerfully, seemingly unfazed by my presence or the barking dog. "You must be Alex's friend. I'm Jessica, his girlfriend. He told me to stop by and pick up a few things." I was completely stunned. In the 5 years I'd known Alex, he'd never once mentioned having a girlfriend named Jessica. And why would he have her come by unannounced when he knew I was staying here? Something felt very off, but I was too shocked to challenge her. Yeah, I'm John," I managed to stammer out. "Alex didn't mention anyone would be stopping by." She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how forgetful he can be sometimes. I'll just run upstairs and grab what I need. Won't be more than a few minutes." Before I could object, she was already heading up the stairs. Bailey was still barking his head off, which only added to my growing sense of unease. I debated calling Alex, but it was already after midnight where he was traveling. Plus, I didn't want to seem paranoid if this woman really was his girlfriend. So I sat there anxiously, straining to hear what she was doing upstairs. I could hear drawers and closet doors opening and closing. After about 10 minutes, she came back downstairs with a small duffel bag. "All set," she said brightly. "Thanks so much. I'll let Alex know I stopped by. Happy New Year." And just like that, she was gone. The whole encounter left me feeling deeply unsettled. I immediately texted Alex asking if he'd sent someone named Jessica to pick up some things. Then I did a thorough search of the house to make sure nothing obvious was missing. About an hour later, my girlfriend Tricia arrived. We had plans to watch the ball drop together and spend the night. I told her about the weird encounter with Jessica and how on edge it had left me feeling. Tricia tried to reassure me that it was probably just a misunderstanding, but I could tell she was a bit freaked out too. We tried to settle in and enjoy the rest of the evening, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around 1 a.m., we decided to head up to bed. As we were getting ready to sleep, my phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Hey man, just got your message. I have no idea who that woman is. Definitely not my girlfriend. Did she take anything? Should we call the police?" My blood ran cold as I read his words. I quickly filled Tricia in, and we both started to panic. Who was this woman, and why did she have a key to Alex's house? What was she really doing here? Just as we were debating whether to leave or call the police, we heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open the bedroom door. The handle jiggled once, twice, 3 times, then silence. Tricia and I froze, hardly daring to breathe. Bailey, who had been sleeping at the foot of the bed, was now fully alert and growling softly. We stared at the door in terror, willing it to stay closed. After what felt like an eternity, we heard hushed voices in the hallway. It sounded like at least 2 or 3 people. My mind was racing. Had Jessica come back with others to rob the place? Were they going to hurt us? I quietly reached for my phone to call 911, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. As the operator answered, I whispered our situation as quickly and quietly as I could. They assured me officers were on the way and to stay put. The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. We could hear the intruders moving around downstairs, opening and closing drawers. Occasionally, footsteps would come back up the stairs, and we'd hold our breath until they retreated again. Finally, mercifully, we heard sirens in the distance. The footsteps downstairs quickened, and then we heard the back door open and slam shut. By the time the police arrived a few minutes later, the house was empty except for us. The officers did a thorough search, but found no sign of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be missing, though it was hard to be sure since it wasn't our house. They took our statements and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but without more to go on, there wasn't much they could do. Needless to say, Tricia and I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. We stayed up till dawn, jumping at every little noise. As soon as it was light out, we packed up our stuff and Bailey and got the hell out of there. Alex came home early when he heard what happened. He changed all the locks and installed a security system, but the police never found any leads on who the woman was or how she got a key. To this day, thinking about that night sends chills down my spine. Who were those people, and what did they really want? I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in someone else's home again. The whole experience left me shaken in ways I still struggle to describe. It's not just the fear of what could have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. It's the unsettling realization of how vulnerable we all are, even in places we think are safe. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise would jolt me awake, convinced someone was trying to break in. I installed extra locks on all my doors and windows. I even got my own security camera system, something I never thought I'd need. Tricia and I are still together, but that night definitely put a strain on our relationship for a while. She was understandably freaked out and angry that I had put us in that situation, even though it wasn't really my fault. We both started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma and anxiety. Bailey seemed to bounce back quicker than we did, but even he was on edge for a while after that night. Alex said he would bark at every little noise for weeks, something he'd never done before. I've replayed that night in my head countless times, wondering if there was something I should have done differently. Should I have confronted Jessica more forcefully when she first showed up? Should we have left the house as soon as Alex said he didn't know her? But in the moment, everything happened so fast and nothing seemed quite real until it was too late. The hardest part is not knowing. Not knowing who those people were, what they wanted, or if they'll ever come back. Not knowing if it was just a random crime of opportunity or if we were specifically targeted for some reason. The uncertainty gnaws at me, especially on quiet nights when my mind starts to wander. I've become hyper-vigilant about home security now. I always double and triple check that doors and windows are locked. I'm wary of repairmen or delivery people I don't recognize. Part of me knows it's probably an overreaction, but I can't help it. That night shattered my sense of safety in a way I'm not sure will ever fully heal. Alex and I are still friends, but things have been a bit strained. I know it's not his fault, but being in his house brings back too many bad memories. We mostly hang out in public places now. He feels terrible about what happened and has apologized countless times, but there's not really anything he could have done differently either. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get answers about what really happened that night. Was it just a bizarre coincidence that this woman had a key, or was there something more sinister going on? I've gone down internet rabbit holes trying to find similar stories, looking for any kind of explanation. But in the end, I'm left with more questions than answers. All I know for sure is that New Year's Eve will never be the same for me again. What should have been a night of celebration and new beginnings turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. I'm trying to move forward and not let fear control my life, but it's a daily struggle. All I can do is be grateful that Tricia and I made it out physically unharmed, even if the emotional scars may never fully heal. So if you're reading this and planning to house sit or stay in someone else's home, please be careful. Trust your instincts if something feels off. And remember that even in places that should be safe, danger can find its way in when you least expect it. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and never take your security for granted. You never know when a quiet night at home could turn into the most terrifying experience of your life.